I was 31 that summer, living in Spokane, Washington, and working from home as a freelance photographer. Work had been slow in June, and I was feeling cooped up. I hadn't been outside the city for months. I used to go hiking and camping pretty often when I was younger, and it hit me one Thursday evening. I needed to get away. I wasn't trying to find myself or chase some peaceful moment in the trees. I just wanted to get out of the apartment, breathe some cleaner air, and maybe take some shots for my portfolio. By Friday morning, I had my backpack laid out on the carpet. I didn't own a fancy tent or anything high-tech. I had my old canvas pack, a one-man tent I bought 5 years ago from a sporting goods store, a sleeping bag, a roll of paracord, a decent pocket knife, a flashlight, some freeze-dried meals, a lighter, and 2 full water bottles. I wasn't planning to go out for more than 2 nights. I had a GPS app on my phone and a printed map just in case. I figured that was enough. I packed some instant coffee, a small camping stove, a thin flannel shirt, and my camera gear. I drove out that afternoon, heading northeast into Idaho. I'd found this spot on a forum. Some guy had written about a little-used trail near Priest Lake, a couple miles past the marked campsites. It wasn't on any official list, but it seemed like the kind of place people didn't talk much about so they could keep it to themselves. That sounded perfect to me. I reached the general area around 4 p.m., parked near a logging road, and shouldered my pack. The air smelled like pine and warm dirt. It was dry and still, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears. I followed the trail that looped off the road and eventually found the turnoff the forum post mentioned. It was marked by a fallen log, almost hidden in the brush. I stepped over it and followed the faint path through the trees, hiking deeper and deeper into the forest. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had dipped low. It was a flat, grassy space maybe 40 feet across, surrounded on 3 sides by thick evergreens and backed by a ridge. A little stream ran along the north side. I dropped my pack and started setting up. The soil was soft, and the ground was mostly level, perfect for a tent. I didn't hear any other hikers.
No distant engines.
Just the trickling water and the rustling of leaves. Felt like I'd stepped outside the rest of the world. That first night was calm. I ate one of the freeze-dried meals with some instant coffee and sat on a log, just watching the shadows stretch across the grass. When it got dark, I got into the tent and lay back on my sleeping pad. I could hear the stream through the nylon, and that sound made it easier to fall asleep. I woke up once around 2 a.m. to pee, and the sky was pitch black. No moon, but the stars were so clear it looked like someone had dusted sugar across the whole sky. The next morning, I boiled water for more coffee and then packed up my camera. I hiked uphill from the camp for a while, looking for views. I found a high ridge that overlooked the lake in the distance and snapped a few pictures. On the way back down, I found a pile of elk scat and some fresh tracks, but nothing unusual. I was back at camp by early afternoon. That's when I noticed something small. My tent was zipped differently than I'd left it. I always zip it up from the bottom corner, a habit I've had since my 20s, but it was zipped from the top. I stood there for a second, trying to remember if I'd done it that way without thinking. I didn't want to make it into a big deal. Maybe I had just been in a rush or distracted. Still, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for boot prints or anything out of place. The grass was thick, and there weren't any obvious signs of someone else being there. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just a little on edge from being alone out there. That evening, I made another meal and started a small fire in the stone ring someone had built near the edge of the clearing. I sat by the flames as the sky went from orange to blue to black. I was tired enough that I didn't dwell on the zipper thing anymore. I got into the tent, zipped it up from the bottom corner like always, and drifted off. At some point in the night, I thought I heard a branch snap. Not like an animal moving through, more like something being stepped on. Sharp and sudden. I stayed still for a long time, listening. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, I unzipped the tent and froze. There was a small item on the ground just outside. A gray Bic lighter. I didn't own a gray one. I carried a red one I'd had for over a year. I picked it up. It wasn't dirty or weathered. It looked almost new. I looked around the clearing. Nothing else seemed out of place. My pack was zipped and undisturbed. My camera gear was fine, but someone had been close enough to leave that lighter outside my tent, or drop it nearby. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I didn't panic. Not yet. I walked a wide circle around the clearing, this time more carefully. I spotted something about 20 feet into the trees, 2 boot prints. They were faint, but fresh. Deeper heel marks, and they pointed toward the clearing, not away from it. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had. I thought about leaving right then, but I also didn't want to get lost or twisted around in panic. I knew I'd have to go the same way I came, and I didn't want to be careless on the trail. I still had one night left, and the trail back was about 3 hours of hiking. I told myself I'd stay one more night, just to rest and leave in the morning. But that whole day, I couldn't shake the feeling. I sat by the stream, just watching the trees. I didn't even take photos. I didn't cook dinner. I ate a protein bar cold and kept my knife clipped to my belt. Every small sound made me glance up. I didn't see anything, but I never really relaxed. When it got dark, I didn't light a fire. I crawled into the tent with my flashlight and tried to sleep. I zipped it up the usual way and kept the flashlight in my hand. For hours, I just lay there listening. At maybe 1:30 a.m., I heard something again. This time it wasn't a branch, it was a low rustle like fabric brushing against bark. Then silence. Then maybe 10 minutes later, a soft thump, like a footfall on packed dirt. I didn't move. I kept breathing shallow and quiet. My heartbeat felt loud. I lay there, not blinking, staring at the roof of the tent. I held my knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I didn't dare unzip the tent or make a sound. It was like being paralyzed. Eventually, after maybe another 30 minutes, I didn't hear anything else. I stayed awake until dawn. The moment the sky started to lighten, I packed everything in a rush. I didn't even bother rolling my sleeping bag. I just shoved it into the pack. I was moving by 6 a.m., heading down the trail fast and without stopping. Halfway back to the road, I turned around out of instinct. On the edge of the trees, maybe 40 or 50 feet back, I saw someone. Just a glimpse. A man standing still, partially behind a tree. I didn't see a face, just the silhouette. Tall still, watching me. I turned and kept walking. Not running, just walking as fast as I could without tripping. My legs were shaking. My back ached from the pack, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the logging road, the sunlight felt unreal. I unlocked the car, tossed the gear in, and drove off without looking back. Back home in Spokane, I checked all my photos, trying to see if I'd accidentally caught anything unusual. I didn't. Nothing strange in the background, no shapes in the trees, just the same peaceful woods. But that image of the man behind the tree stayed burned into my mind. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone maybe followed me, maybe stood outside my tent, maybe left a lighter? Nothing was stolen. I wasn't hurt, but I knew someone had been there. Someone who never said a word, never showed themselves fully, just watched. I didn't go camping again that year, or the next. I still hike sometimes in daylight on busy trails, but I never go deep into the woods alone anymore. I still have the gray lighter in my drawer. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe to remind myself that there are things out there worse than stories about monsters. Because the scariest part wasn't what I saw, it was what I didn't. The quiet, the watching, the patience. That trip ended my habit of solo camping. It reminded me that even without ghosts or creatures, real danger can walk on 2 legs and breathe quietly in the trees, close enough to touch your tent without leaving a trace. It was late summer, the sun setting earlier than usual, casting a pale orange light across the darkening landscape. I had decided to take a solo trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. I was 29, just looking for some time away from work and life's usual noise, to disconnect and reset my mind. A few weeks of hiking and camping by myself would be the perfect escape. My plan was simple: find a secluded spot, set up camp, and enjoy the silence of nature. The hike to the spot I had chosen wasn't especially hard, but it wasn't easy either. The trail was old, not often used by people, and wound through thick trees and dense underbrush. I had to take my time, carefully navigating through the rough terrain. By the time I arrived at my chosen spot, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It was a small clearing beside a creek, tucked away just off the trail. The sound of the water was calming, a soft trickle that seemed to harmonize with the rustling leaves above. I set up camp quickly, my movements automatic. I knew how to do this. Tent up, fire pit cleared, sleeping bag and gear inside. It all felt routine, almost comforting. But as I stood there, looking at the campfire I'd built with dry wood and kindling, something about the place felt off. It wasn't the beauty of the spot itself. No, it was beautiful in its own quiet way, but rather the silence that felt too still. There was no wind, no birds, no critters stirring. Just me, the trees, and the water. Maybe it was just my imagination, but something about that stillness felt unsettling. I brushed it off, attributing it to being alone in the woods for the first time in a while. I wasn't used to the kind of quiet that comes when there's no one else around. No sounds of life except the trees and the occasional trickle of water. I figured I'd settle in and make the best of it. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and with night falling, the temperature began to drop quickly. I stoked the fire, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The flames crackled, providing some warmth against the cool air, but the stillness was unyielding. I stared into the fire, lost in my thoughts, wondering if I had made the right choice by coming out here alone. I thought about my friends, some of whom had tried to warn me about camping in such remote areas. Be careful, man. You don't know what's out there. One of them had said when I told him my plans. I had brushed it off then, but now, as I sat alone in the darkness, I wondered what he meant. That's when I heard it. A faint sound in the distance, something like a twig snapping. I stiffened, my attention snapping toward the noise. It was odd, because I had been so attuned to the stillness of the night that I should have heard the wind, the trees, or animals before anything else. But no, it was like something had purposely broken the silence. The sound came again, another snap of a twig, a bit closer this time. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was just the paranoia creeping in. I'd read enough about people getting weird when they're alone in nature, especially when they don't expect it. Still, something didn't sit right. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, holding it close, and scanned the darkness beyond the edge of the clearing. Nothing. The light bounced off tree trunks and underbrush, casting eerie shadows. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. I sat back down, trying to shake the feeling, but it lingered. The sound came again, closer still this time. I had no idea what it was. I didn't hear footsteps or breathing, just the sharp, distinct snap of twigs. Maybe it was an animal, but it felt too deliberate, too purposeful, like something or someone was trying to sneak up on me. My heart raced, and I took a deep breath to calm myself. I wasn't going to let fear control me. I stood up slowly, moving toward the edge of the campfire's light. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement in the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal, but there was no way to be sure. The darkness of the forest beyond the fire's reach was impenetrable, and the movement was too fast, too deliberate. I squinted, straining to make sense of it. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing just at the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. My breath hitched. I was being paranoid, I told myself. It was probably just a trick of the light, my mind playing games on me. I stepped back, intending to head back to my campfire, but the sound came again, closer still. This time, it was unmistakable. Someone was walking, just on the edge of the clearing. I froze. I could hear them moving, the faint rustle of leaves underfoot. My heart was pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to yell out, to confront whoever or whatever was out there, but something held me back. My throat tightened. My legs felt like lead. I couldn't move. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the sound of the footsteps moving closer, the soft crunching of leaves beneath weight, until finally, just at the edge of my campsite, I saw something. A silhouette, barely discernible, standing still just beyond the reach of the firelight. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at it, but the figure didn't move. My mind raced, thinking of all the worst-case scenarios. Was it someone playing a prank? Or worse, was it someone with bad intentions? But then, without warning, the figure turned and vanished into the trees, disappearing into the darkness as silently as it had appeared. I stood frozen for a few moments longer, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But the thumping of my heart was real. The cold sweat on my skin was real. The fear was real. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I wasn't staying to find out. I gathered my things quickly, almost frantically, not caring if I left some items behind. The flashlight was my only source of light, and I kept it trained on the trees, but there was no more movement. Nothing else. Just the crackling fire and the distant sound of the creek. I didn't take the time to pack up my tent or even think about the fire. I grabbed what I needed and left, walking briskly down the trail, not looking back once. The woods were unnervingly quiet as I made my way back, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call from the trees. It wasn't until I reached the parking area that I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I'd made it out. Whatever it was, whatever I had seen or heard, it hadn't followed me. I was safe. The whole experience still didn't make sense to me. But as I sat in my truck, the engine running, the headlights illuminating the empty trail behind me, I realized I would never go back to that spot again. It had been too much, too strange, too unsettling. But most of all, it was the silence of the forest, that unnatural stillness, that left me feeling like something wasn't quite right. In the end, I realized it wasn't the fear of the unknown that scared me the most. It was the fact that sometimes, the wilderness can feel more alive than we realize. And when you're alone out there, you're at the mercy of whatever else might be in the woods with you. I drove home that night, the headlights cutting through the dark highway, and I never spoke about it to anyone. I still don't. Some things are better left unexplained. I went on a solo camping trip in early September 2019. I was 34 years old at the time, living in Spokane, Washington. I'd spent most of my adult life working as a mechanical inspector for a small local firm. It wasn't a bad job, just repetitive, and after 10 years of it, I'd gotten into the habit of taking small solo trips to disconnect from everything. No phone reception, no work emails, no noise. Just me, a tent, and some quiet. This time, I picked a new area, a patch of national forest near Priest Lake, Idaho. I'd heard it was remote, but not totally inaccessible. It was far enough from any major trails that I figured I wouldn't run into other people, but close enough to some logging roads that I could drive most of the way in. I spent a few hours studying the area on topo maps, packed enough food and water for 3 days, loaded up my old Nissan Xterra, and drove out on a Thursday morning. I parked on a narrow dirt road that cut through the forest. It wasn't an official trailhead or anything, just a turnoff where I could pull the vehicle partially into the brush and leave it hidden. I didn't want to make it obvious someone was camping nearby. I hiked for about an hour, mostly downhill through pine and spruce, thick moss covering everything in green. The ground was soft, and everything smelled like damp earth and dry wood. Eventually, I found a spot next to a creek. It wasn't big, just a few feet wide, but it ran fast and clear, and I could hear it from anywhere in my little clearing. That sound always helped me sleep. I set up my tent a few feet from the water, made sure it was on high ground in case of rain, and built a small fire pit from rocks I gathered nearby. I brought a compact gas stove for cooking, so I didn't need to collect wood or worry about keeping a big flame going, but I liked having a little fire in the evenings for warmth and comfort. That first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned chili, watched the light fade behind the trees, and went to sleep just after dark. No animals, no strange noises, nothing. I remember thinking it was one of the most peaceful nights I'd had out there in a long time. The next day, I did some basic exploring. I followed the creek upstream for a while, climbed a small ridge, and spotted some deer tracks in the mud. I didn't see any people or hear any distant vehicles. I was alone out there, which was exactly what I wanted. I came back to camp around 4 in the afternoon, made some ramen, and sat near the fire ring with a book until it got too dark to read. Then I crawled into the tent and zipped it shut. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. I didn't want to go far, so I stepped just a few feet out of the tent, used the edge of the creek, and stood there for a few seconds listening. The air was perfectly still. No wind, no insects, not even frogs. Just the water running past me. That quiet was what struck me. Even in the middle of nowhere, there's usually something making noise at night. Leaves shifting, branches creaking, the occasional coyote. But it was silent. I remember thinking it was strange, but I was half asleep, so I just zipped myself back inside and fell asleep again. The next morning, everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place. I ate some trail mix and a protein bar for breakfast and decided to head farther downstream. I wanted to find a wider section of the creek where I could maybe sit and soak my feet or skip rocks. I followed it for a good half hour before finding a little bend where the banks opened up. I took off my boots and socks, dipped my feet in the water, and just sat there. About 10 minutes later, I noticed something in the mud a few feet away. At first I thought it was another deer track, but when I got closer, it didn't look right. It was a boot print. Not a hiking boot, though more like a work boot. Deep tread, fairly big, definitely made by someone heavier than me. I wear a size 10.5, and this print was clearly larger than mine. I crouched down to look at it. It was fresh. I could tell because the edges hadn't crumbled or dried out yet. It had to be from the last 12 hours. I hadn't seen or heard anyone. No camps, no voices, no fears. And this print wasn't heading up or downstream. It came straight out of the woods toward the creek and then disappeared. I looked around but didn't see any others, at least not in the soft mud. I felt my stomach tighten a little. It wasn't unusual to run into other campers or hunters in a place like this, but most people make some noise, and this boot print wasn't on any trail. It was in the middle of thick, uneven forest. I didn't want to overreact, so I walked back to camp, taking a slightly different route just to be sure I wasn't imagining anything. When I got there, everything was the same. My tent, my stove, my food, all untouched. I checked around the perimeter of my site for more boot prints. Nothing, just pine needles and packed dirt. I tried to forget about it, told myself it could have been an old track, maybe even my own from the day before that had shifted in the mud. Couldn't be sure. That night, I had a harder time falling asleep. I kept hearing small sounds outside, twigs snapping, a faint crunch of something in the distance. I told myself it was deer or raccoons. That's all it ever is out here. I didn't hear anything close to the tent, and eventually I drifted off. Then I woke up around 4:30 a.m. to a sharp, distinct sound, a heavy thud, like someone had dropped a piece of wood or stepped on a log. It was close. My ears were on high alert immediately. I didn't move. I just lay there, breathing slow, trying not to make a sound. A few seconds later, I heard it again. Thud, but farther off now, like whoever or whatever had made it was moving away. I stayed perfectly still for another hour until the sun came up. Then I got out, checked the area, and saw something that made my skin crawl. A few feet from my tent, there was a line in the dirt. It wasn't a boot print this time. It looked like someone had dragged a stick or a branch in a half circle around part of my campsite. It wasn't there the night before. It started near the creek, cut close to the tent, and curved around toward the trees on the other side. I followed it for a few feet until it just stopped. That was it for me. I packed everything as fast as I could. No breakfast, no coffee, nothing. Just shoved the tent into my pack, stuffed the sleeping bag in without rolling it, and slung the bag over my shoulders. I had about a mile hike back to the Xterra, and I moved faster than I ever had in my life. Every little noise made me whip my head around. I kept thinking about that boot print and the line in the dirt. Someone had been watching me. That much I was sure of. When I got to the car, I noticed something else that turned my stomach. The passenger door wasn't fully closed. I was sure I'd shut all the doors when I left. I always do. I checked the interior. Nothing missing, nothing moved, but the glove box was open. I didn't leave it that way. I hadn't even opened it on this trip. I got in, locked all the doors, and drove straight out of the forest, only stopping when I hit pavement again. I didn't relax until I was back in Spokane. Even then, I kept thinking someone might have followed me. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. It just felt too strange, like something people would think I made up or was exaggerating. But I know what I saw. That boot print wasn't mine. The noise outside the tent wasn't an animal. And the line in the dirt wasn't natural. Someone was out there. Not camping, not hiking, just watching. I never went back to that part of the forest. I started taking shorter trips to more popular areas, places where I knew other people would be nearby. It wasn't the solitude that scared me. It was realizing that out in the woods, you're not as alone as you think. Not always. And whoever was out there that night, they knew exactly how to move without being seen. That thought still gets under my skin. I was lucky. Nothing happened. I got out. But it taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Out there, it's not bears or wolves you need to worry about. It's people. The kind who stay just out of sight. The kind who don't make a sound. The kind who draw a line around your tent in the dark and walk away like it's a game. I went on a solo camping trip in early September 2019. I was 34 years old at the time, living in Spokane, Washington. I'd spent most of my adult life working as a mechanical inspector for a small local firm. It wasn't a bad job, just repetitive, and after 10 years of it, I'd gotten into the habit of taking small solo trips to disconnect from everything. No phone reception, no work emails, no noise. Just me, a tent, and some quiet. This time, I picked a new area, a patch of national forest near Priest Lake, Idaho. I'd heard it was remote, but not totally inaccessible. It was far enough from any major trails that I figured I wouldn't run into other people, but close enough to some logging roads that I could drive most of the way in. I spent a few hours studying the area on topo maps, packed enough food and water for 3 days, loaded up my old Nissan Xterra, and drove out on a Thursday morning. I parked on a narrow dirt road that cut through the forest. It wasn't an official trailhead or anything, just a turnoff where I could pull the vehicle partially into the brush and leave it hidden. I didn't want to make it obvious someone was camping nearby. I hiked for about an hour, mostly downhill through pine and spruce, thick moss covering everything in green. The ground was soft, and everything smelled like damp earth and dry wood. Eventually, I found a spot next to a creek. It wasn't big, just a few feet wide, but it ran fast and clear, and I could hear it from anywhere in my little clearing. That sound always helped me sleep. I set up my tent a few feet from the water, made sure it was on high ground in case of rain, and built a small fire pit from rocks I gathered nearby. I brought a compact gas stove for cooking, so I didn't need to collect wood or worry about keeping a big flame going, but I liked having a little fire in the evenings for warmth and comfort. That first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned chili, watched the light fade behind the trees, and went to sleep just after dark. No animals, no strange noises, nothing. I remember thinking it was one of the most peaceful nights I'd had out there in a long time. The next day, I did some basic exploring. I followed the creek upstream for a while, climbed a small ridge, and spotted some deer tracks in the mud. I didn't see any people or hear any distant vehicles. I was alone out there, which was exactly what I wanted. I came back to camp around 4 in the afternoon, made some ramen, and sat near the fire ring with a book until it got too dark to read. Then I crawled into the tent and zipped it shut. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. I didn't want to go far, so I stepped just a few feet out of the tent, used the edge of the creek, and stood there for a few seconds listening. The air was perfectly still. No wind, no insects, not even frogs. Just the water running past me. That quiet was what struck me. Even in the middle of nowhere, there's usually something making noise at night. Leaves shifting, branches creaking, the occasional coyote. But it was silent. I remember thinking it was strange, but I was half asleep, so I just zipped myself back inside and fell asleep again. The next morning, everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place. I ate some trail mix and a protein bar for breakfast and decided to head farther downstream. I wanted to find a wider section of the creek where I could maybe sit and soak my feet or skip rocks. I followed it for a good half hour before finding a little bend where the banks opened up. I took off my boots and socks, dipped my feet in the water, and just sat there. About 10 minutes later, I noticed something in the mud a few feet away. At first I thought it was another deer track, but when I got closer, it didn't look right. It was a boot print. Not a hiking boot, though, more like a work boot. Deep tread, fairly big, definitely made by someone heavier than me. I wear a size 10.5, and this print was clearly larger than mine. I crouched down to look at it. It was fresh. I could tell because the edges hadn't crumbled or dried out yet. It had to be from the last 12 hours. I hadn't seen or heard anyone. No camps, no voices, no fears. And this print wasn't heading up or downstream. It came straight out of the woods toward the creek and then disappeared. I looked around but didn't see any others, at least not in the soft mud. I felt my stomach tighten a little. It wasn't unusual to run into other campers or hunters in a place like this, but most people make some noise, and this boot print wasn't on any trail. It was in the middle of thick, uneven forest. I didn't want to overreact, so I walked back to camp, taking a slightly different route just to be sure I wasn't imagining anything. When I got there, everything was the same. My tent, my stove, my food, all untouched. I checked around the perimeter of my site for more boot prints. Nothing, just pine needles and packed dirt. I tried to forget about it, told myself it could have been an old track, maybe even my own from the day before that had shifted in the mud. Couldn't be sure. That night, I had a harder time falling asleep. I kept hearing small sounds outside, twigs snapping, a faint crunch of something in the distance. I told myself it was deer or raccoons. That's all it ever is out here. I didn't hear anything close to the tent, and eventually I drifted off. Then I woke up around 4:30 a.m. to a sharp, distinct sound, a heavy thud, like someone had dropped a piece of wood or stepped on a log. It was close. My ears were on high alert immediately. I didn't move. I just lay there, breathing slow, trying not to make a sound. A few seconds later, I heard it again. Thud, but farther off now, like whoever or whatever had made it was moving away. I stayed perfectly still for another hour until the sun came up. Then I got out, checked the area, and saw something that made my skin crawl. A few feet from my tent, there was a line in the dirt. It wasn't a boot print this time. It looked like someone had dragged a stick or a branch in a half circle around part of my campsite. It wasn't there the night before. It started near the creek, cut close to the tent, and curved around toward the trees on the other side. I followed it for a few feet until it just stopped. That was it for me. I packed everything as fast as I could. No breakfast, no coffee, nothing. Just shoved the tent into my pack, stuffed the sleeping bag in without rolling it, and slung the bag over my shoulders. I had about a mile hike back to the Xterra, and I moved faster than I ever had in my life. Every little noise made me whip my head around. I kept thinking about that boot print and the line in the dirt. Someone had been watching me. That much I was sure of. When I got to the car, I noticed something else that turned my stomach. The passenger door wasn't fully closed. I was sure I'd shut all the doors when I left. I always do. I checked the interior. Nothing missing, nothing moved, but the glove box was open. I didn't leave it that way. I hadn't even opened it on this trip. I got in, locked all the doors, and drove straight out of the forest, only stopping when I hit pavement again. I didn't relax until I was back in Spokane. Even then, I kept thinking someone might have followed me. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. It just felt too strange, like something people would think I made up or was exaggerating. But I know what I saw. That boot print wasn't mine. The noise outside the tent wasn't an animal. And the line in the dirt wasn't natural. Someone was out there. Not camping, not hiking, just watching. I never went back to that part of the forest. I started taking shorter trips to more popular areas, places where I knew other people would be nearby. It wasn't the solitude that scared me. It was realizing that out in the woods, you're not as alone as you think. Not always. And whoever was out there that night, they knew exactly how to move without being seen. That thought still gets under my skin. I was lucky. Nothing happened. I got out. But it taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Out there, it's not bears or wolves you need to worry about. It's people. The kind who stay just out of sight. The kind who don't make a sound. The kind who draw a line around your tent in the dark and walk away like it's a game. I was 31 when I took that camping trip alone in the fall of 2021. I'd just gone through a breakup a few months earlier, and I thought a week off the grid would help me reset. I live in southern Illinois, and I'd always heard good things about the Shawnee National Forest. It's big, remote in places, and not as crowded as other parks, especially in late September. That's exactly what I was looking for. Peace, quiet, and space to think. I packed up my gear in my old Toyota Tacoma, filled the tank, and made the drive on a cool Wednesday morning. The plan was simple. I'd hike out to a spot I'd found online, a primitive site near Jackson Falls, and stay there for 6 nights. No phone, no GPS, no distractions. I brought a topographic map, a compass, and enough food and water to last the week. I had everything from freeze-dried meals to protein bars, plus a portable water filter for when I'd need to refill. I also carried a small .38 revolver, not because I was paranoid, but because I didn't like the idea of being completely unarmed that far out. I got to the trailhead around noon. There was only one other car in the dirt lot, and it looked like it hadn't moved in a couple days. I double-checked my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking. The trail was narrow but easy to follow, covered in fallen leaves and winding between huge boulders and limestone cliffs. The forest was quiet, with nothing but the crunch of my boots and the occasional bird call. I felt good, focused, calm, and excited to get away from everything. It took me about 2 hours to reach the site. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat area near a rock outcrop with enough space to pitch a tent and build a fire ring. I set up camp carefully. My tent was a 2-person model, nothing fancy, but reliable. I placed it so the door faced away from the slope, anchored it down, and laid out my sleeping bag and pad inside. Then I collected firewood, cleared a small circle of stones for the fire, and cooked a simple dinner, rice and beans with a splash of hot sauce. As night came, the forest cooled fast. The wind moved through the trees with that hollow, empty sound you only get in deep woods. I sat by the fire, watching the flames and thinking about how different everything felt out there. It wasn't scary exactly, just still, isolated. You start to notice things you normally don't. How your heartbeat sounds in your ears, how shadows shift with the firelight, how loud a single twig snap can be. I crawled into my tent around 9, zipped the flap shut, and lay there listening. No cars, no planes, just the faint rustle of leaves and distant animal sounds. I slept light, waking a few times to reposition or check my surroundings. But nothing happened that first night. The second day was quiet, too. I spent the morning hiking a bit, following a dry creek bed and exploring the rocks around the cliffs. I saw some deer tracks and scat, and once I heard what might have been a coyote barking in the distance. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed a set of boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. They were old, at least a day or two, but they looked fresh enough to make me pause. Maybe they belonged to the owner of the car I'd seen at the trailhead. I didn't think too much about it at first. I mean, people hike all over the place, right? The woods aren't mine. But that night, as I was eating dinner and the sun dropped behind the trees, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't completely alone. It wasn't something I saw or heard, just a tightness in my gut, like someone might be watching from the trees. I kept the fire going longer than the night before and didn't go to bed until it had burned down to embers. That night, I woke up twice. The first time was to pee around 1 a.m. The air was freezing, and I had to step away from the tent to go. I didn't hear or see anything, but I had that feeling again, that vague pressure in my chest, like I should be alert. I got back into my bag and tried to sleep. The second time I woke up, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. It might have been a noise, maybe something brushing against the tent. I froze, holding my breath and listening. Nothing, just silence. I told myself it was probably a branch or a raccoon. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The third day was colder, with the sky overcast and gray. I spent the morning near camp, whittling a stick and just sitting with my thoughts. Around noon, I went to refill my water at a small spring about a half-mile away. When I got back to camp, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. One of my firewood piles had been moved. Not scattered, not destroyed, just moved. Neatly, like someone had picked up the logs and res-tacked them in a slightly different spot. At that point, I stopped pretending it was just my imagination. Someone else had been in my camp. I walked the perimeter carefully, scanning the leaves for tracks. I found 2 partial footprints behind my tent. They matched the ones I'd seen near the creek bed. Same tread, same spacing. Definitely a man's boot, bigger than mine. I stood there a long time, looking at those prints, trying to decide what to do. It was too late to hike back to the truck, and honestly, I didn't feel like I was in immediate danger, just unsettled. I had the gun, a whistle, and my hatchet. I figured I'd make it through the night and leave first thing in the morning. That night, I didn't build a fire. I wanted darkness, not light. I cooked early, then doused the fire completely and got into the tent while it was still twilight. I didn't even use a lantern, just lay in the dark, waiting, listening. I kept the revolver next to me and the hatchet under my pillow. I didn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it. Slow footsteps outside the tent. Crunch, crunch, pause, crunch. They were deliberate, careful. Someone was moving just beyond the tent walls. I held my breath, heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I could hear them circling the tent, just once. Then nothing. They didn't touch the tent, didn't try to open it, just walked around it once and then vanished into the woods. I waited until dawn to move. The moment the sky lightened, I packed everything in 10 minutes flat. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just got my gear and started hiking. I had about 6 miles to the trailhead, and I didn't stop once. My ears were tuned to every sound. Branches snapping, birds going quiet, wind through the brush. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the trees to my left, but I didn't look too long. When I got back to the trailhead, my truck was the only vehicle there. The other car was gone. I drove straight home, didn't stop for gas until I was nearly on fumes. When I got home, I locked every door and window. I didn't unpack for a week, just left the gear in the truck and tried to sleep. I never called the police. What would I say? No one hurt me. Nothing was stolen. I didn't even see anyone clearly, but I know someone was out there and they were watching me. They didn't try to scare me off or hurt me. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were testing boundaries. But I'll never forget the way it felt when I realized I wasn't alone out there. I still go camping, but not alone anymore, and never that deep in the woods. I stay at places with other people nearby, families, kids, other hikers. I've traded peace and isolation for safety, and I'm okay with that. Some experiences stay with you, not because they were dramatic or violent, but because they left a mark, quiet, invisible, permanent. And when I think back on it now, I realize I was lucky. Whoever that person was, they decided not to take it further. But they could have. They were out there walking around my tent at 3 in the morning, and they could have done anything. They chose not to. That's what keeps me up sometimes. Not fear, not even paranoia. Just the knowledge that someone was that close. And I never even saw their face. I went camping alone in the spring of 2017 in the northern part of Oregon, not far from a small town called La Pine. I was 32 at the time, and I had taken a week off work just to get away. Things had been overwhelming for a while. Constant emails, long meetings, and I had just gotten out of a 3-year relationship that left me needing space. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just peace, quiet, and time in the woods. I picked a spot about 6 miles off a Forest Service road, not near any main campground, but legal for dispersed camping. I had found it on a hiking blog that mentioned a secluded area near an old logging route that hadn't been used in years. There were no facilities, no people, no cell signal, just trees, dirt, and the sound of your own footsteps. I brought my backpacking gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, headlamp, knife, and enough food for a week. I packed light, but enough to stay comfortable. The hike in was long, but not hard. The air smelled like wet pine needles and cold earth. I took a shortcut that shaved off a mile and brought me to a narrow stream with a small clearing just big enough for a tent. There were broken branches all around and a few rusted pieces of metal off to the side that looked like old tools or parts from logging equipment. Nothing out of the ordinary for the area, The spot felt perfect. It was quiet. So quiet I could hear the wind moving through the tops of the trees in different layers, like waves. I set up camp by early afternoon, boiled some water, and made coffee. I sat on a log and didn't move for almost an hour. That's what I had come for. The first night was calm. I stayed up for a bit, watching the sky turn from pink to gray to black. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, not from people or animals. I ate a cold dinner, crawled into my tent, and listened to the sound of the stream. I slept deeply, better than I had in months. The second day, I woke up with the sun. I made oatmeal and walked upstream to see if there was a better view. I followed the water for almost a mile and found the remnants of an old fire ring and a crushed beer can with faded lettering, probably years old. I didn't see anyone, no boot prints, no signs of other campers. I stayed out exploring until late afternoon, then came back, collected some firewood, and made a small controlled fire to cook dinner. I put it out fully before dusk. By then, the woods had gone totally still. Not even birds were moving around. That night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something. At first, it was a light crack, like a stick snapping. Not loud, but close enough to jolt me awake. I lay still in my sleeping bag, not moving, not breathing hard, just listening. The air inside the tent was cold, and I could see my breath faintly in the moonlight leaking through the fabric. Then another crack, then silence. I waited for more sounds. After 5 minutes of nothing, I convinced myself it was probably just a branch falling or maybe a deer stepping on something. I heard no footsteps, no breathing, no movement. Still, I kept my knife close by and left my boots in the tent in case I had to get out quickly. I didn't sleep much that night. The third day, I tried to shake it off. I went for a long hike, further than I'd planned. I tried to enjoy the trees, the silence, the moss covering the ground like thick green carpet, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. I felt off, like someone was behind me, even when I knew no one was there. The kind of feeling that creeps up your spine and doesn't go away. When I got back to camp, I looked around carefully. I checked the edges of the clearing, looked for boot prints, cigarette butts, any sign that someone had been near my camp. There was nothing. Everything was just as I'd left it. That night, I decided not to cook anything. I ate a protein bar and stayed zipped up in my sleeping bag, trying to stay warm. I turned off my headlamp early to conserve the battery and lay there in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard the snapping again. This time, it wasn't just one sound. There were several coming from different directions, first one to the north, then one to the west, then one behind the tent. Slow and spaced out like someone walking around the perimeter. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. Felt like I could hear it through the sleeping bag. I stayed perfectly still. The sounds stopped. I waited, holding my breath for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only 10 minutes. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I drifted into shallow sleep out of pure exhaustion. In the morning, I got out of the tent and did a wide sweep around the area. This time I did find something. Just outside the clearing, maybe 30 feet from the tent, I found a small pile of rocks. 6 of them stacked neatly on top of each other. I hadn't made that. I was sure of it. I don't even remember seeing those rocks the day before. I circled the pile. There were no footprints in the soft dirt, no drag marks, no signs of how they had gotten there. It looked recent. The rocks were clean, no moss, no dirt. Something about it unsettled me. It felt deliberate, not like nature, more like someone wanted it seen. That day, I kept my knife on me at all times. I didn't go far from camp. I kept checking over my shoulder. My stomach was tight the whole day, like I was waiting for something. I didn't eat much. I started packing some of my gear back into my bag, just in case I decided to leave early. That night, it was colder. The wind had picked up and the trees groaned softly, their tops swaying against each other. I didn't sleep. I lay with my boots on, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, waiting. Around 2 a.m., I heard breathing outside the tent. Not an animal. Not that low, heavy kind that deer or bears make. This was human. Shallow, uneven, nervous. My blood went cold. I didn't move. The breathing stayed for maybe 10 seconds, then a light scraping sound, like someone dragging their hand across the tent fabric, came from the far side, near my feet. I almost yelled, but I didn't. I stayed dead quiet. Then it was gone. No footsteps, no running, just gone. I waited until sunrise before getting out. When I did, there were no marks, no tracks, nothing. Just silence and frost on the grass. But the rock pile had changed. It was knocked over. The rocks were scattered, some of them missing. I didn't touch it. I packed the rest of my things quickly and left. The hike back felt 3 times as long. Every sound in the woods made me jump. At one point, I thought I saw someone far off through the trees, a dark shape just standing there. But when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't stop. I walked until my legs burned. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just kept moving. I made it to my car by mid-afternoon. It was untouched. No scratches, no broken windows. Just sitting there like nothing had happened. I drove straight to a motel 2 hours away and slept with the lights on. I didn't tell anyone about it for months. When I finally did, I downplayed it. I made it sound like I had just gotten spooked, maybe overreacted to normal forest sounds. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Since then, I've gone camping again, but never alone, and never that far off the map. I think what scared me most wasn't what happened, but how easily it could have turned worse. If I had stepped out of the tent that night, if I had made a sound, I don't know what I would have found or what would have found me. That kind of quiet, that kind of isolation, it does something to people. Or it attracts people already broken. I'll never go back to that spot again. I don't care how beautiful it was. Peace and quiet aren't worth it if you don't know who else is out there watching you in the dark. It was September of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip up north in Michigan, not too far from a small town called Lewiston. I was 29 at the time, recently laid off from my job at a small manufacturing company in Lansing. I didn't really have anything better to do and needed to get away from everything for a while. I wanted to clear my head, be alone for a bit, and just let the days pass by in peace. I wasn't really a survivalist or anything like that, but I'd done enough weekend hiking and car camping trips to feel confident going out on my own for a few days. I picked a small state forest campground that I'd read about online. Very remote, only about 5 campsites, no running water, and a narrow dirt road that took almost 20 minutes to drive from the highway. The nearest gas station was at least a half hour away, and there was no cell service at all. It was the kind of place where you didn't just stumble upon it, you had to know where it was. That was part of what drew me to it. I packed everything I thought I'd need. A small 2-person tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, freeze-dried meals, water jugs, a hatchet, and all the usual gear. I had an old red cooler that still worked and filled it with ice and some basic stuff like eggs, cheese, and cold cuts. I also brought a thick notebook and a couple of pens, planning to write out some thoughts while I was out there. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just said I'd be up north for a few days. That's the kind of thing that seemed fine at the time. The drive up was quiet, and the last part of the road into the forest was rough and narrow. My 2008 Subaru Outback handled it all right, but the trees got thick fast, and I could tell not many people had been through there recently. The campground was completely empty when I got there. There were 5 sites, all with a small fire ring and an old wooden picnic table. I picked the one furthest from the entrance, near a small slope that led down to a shallow creek. The trees were tall and dense, mostly maple and pine, and the sun filtered through in patches. It felt exactly like what I needed, total quiet. That first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, got a fire going, made some food, and walked around a bit. I saw a few deer in the distance and heard an owl somewhere overhead once it got dark. That night, I lay in my tent listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional crack of branches. I'd been in the woods enough to know that noises like that are normal. Everything creaks and snaps out there, especially when it cools down at night. The next morning, I made some coffee on the little propane stove and walked the perimeter of the campground again, just to get a better sense of the place. There was a small hill behind my site, and when I climbed up it, I could see a larger clearing off in the distance. I made a mental note to explore it later. For most of the day, I sat by the fire, reading, writing, and just listening to the forest. I didn't see anyone else. No other cars came down that road. I hadn't seen a ranger or even any tire tracks in the dirt besides my own. I liked that. I wanted to be alone. That second night, I noticed something odd when I went to get more firewood. There were 2 broken branches lying across the path near the creek. Not fresh, but clearly moved recently. I hadn't walked that way since the day before, and I didn't remember stepping over those. Still, I figured they could have fallen or shifted naturally. I didn't think much of it. The fire kept me warm, and I went to bed around 10. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was more like crunching, slow, deliberate steps on dry leaves. I lay perfectly still, heart racing. I've heard raccoons and deer and even coyotes at night before, and they usually move quickly or make higher-pitched noises. This was different, heavy, measured, human-like, but it didn't come close to the tent. After a few minutes, it stopped. I stayed awake for at least an hour, just listening, staring at the ceiling of the tent in total darkness. Eventually, I must have drifted off. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around. Nothing looked disturbed. No tracks I could clearly identify. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, or a large deer walking through the site. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept glancing into the trees that day, listening more carefully. I spent most of that third day closer to the tent. I didn't go exploring like I'd planned. I made a bigger fire that night, cooked more food than I needed, and kept the flashlight in my pocket at all times. When it got dark, I sat by the fire for a long time, just watching the flames. I kept hearing faint sounds, but the woods are always full of those. It wasn't until close to midnight that I heard something that made my stomach drop. It was a sharp metallic clink, like something tapping on metal. I froze. I had my cooler latched shut next to the picnic table. I turned my flashlight toward it and saw nothing. The sound stopped. I stayed up for a long time, shining the light in every direction. Again, I didn't see anyone or anything, and eventually I crawled into the tent, locking the zipper tight. I didn't sleep well. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard movement, or breathing, or leaves rustling. I was half asleep when I heard what sounded like footsteps again. They were close, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the tent. I held my breath. I didn't move. Then silence. No footsteps walking away, just silence. I waited, barely blinking. After what felt like half an hour, I turned on the flashlight and shined it through the mesh of the tent. Nothing, just trees, shadows, a lot of shadows. In the morning, I stepped outside and checked the perimeter again. That's when I saw it. My cooler was sitting about 2 feet from where I'd left it. Not tipped over, not raided, just moved. And there was a faint smear of dirt on the top, like someone had placed their hand there. No claw marks, no animal bites, just a handprint. I stood there for a long time. I hadn't heard a car, hadn't seen a soul. Whoever was out there was doing everything quietly and deliberately. I knew then that someone had been watching my campsite at night. I didn't know why or for how long, but I knew it. I made the decision right then to pack up and leave. I didn't want to spend another night there. It took me an hour to break everything down and load up the car. I kept glancing into the trees, waiting to see someone step out, but no one did. I was just about to turn the key in the ignition when I noticed something else. On the back of my car, drawn in the dust on the rear window, was a shape. A simple outline of a hand, fingers spread. It hadn't been there before. The rest of the window was evenly coated in road dust, but that spot was freshly wiped. I didn't wait. I backed out, turned the car around, and drove down that rough road as fast as I could without bottoming out. Every bump felt like it would break an axle, but I didn't stop. Not until I was back on the highway with cell service. I pulled into a gas station and just sat there, trying to calm myself. I considered telling someone, maybe the sheriff's office in the next town, but what was I going to say? Someone was creeping around my site at night? Someone moved my cooler and touched my car? There were no cameras, no evidence, and I was already gone. I drove home that day nearly 5 hours straight, only stopping for gas. When I got back, I pulled everything out of the car and double-checked all my gear. I couldn't find anything else unusual, but I still felt like I'd brought something back with me, some kind of dread I couldn't shake. For weeks after, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound outside my apartment window made me jump. I kept checking the locks twice, 3 times. I even stopped camping for a long time, sold some of my gear. I couldn't explain what had happened, and that made it worse. It wasn't some creature or ghost or anything from a storybook. It was just someone, a real person, watching me from the woods, staying hidden, moving quietly, getting closer each night. That's what scared me the most. Not knowing who they were, not knowing what they wanted, not knowing how close they really got. I was lucky I left when I did. I've gone camping again since then, but never alone. Never that deep in the woods. And I always tell someone exactly where I'm going. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just turned 31. I lived in Springfield, Missouri, working as a delivery driver for a parts warehouse. I'd been doing the same thing for over 6 years, and it was starting to wear on me. Days blended together, long hours behind the wheel, no real direction or anything exciting in life. I didn't have many friends left in town. Most had moved away or started families. I didn't have either. That summer was especially hot and humid, the kind where the sweat sticks to your skin even if you're just sitting still. I kept telling myself I needed to get out of the routine, clear my head, do something different for a few days. I hadn't taken any time off in over a year. I decided I'd go camping alone, maybe up near the edge of Twain National Forest, far enough from the usual campsites where I wouldn't run into anyone. I didn't want a social thing. I just wanted space. I packed my gear the night before. Tent, small propane stove, a cooler full of basic food, eggs, lunch meat, bottled water. I brought a sleeping bag, a basic first aid kit, 2 knives, a multi-tool, some rope, and a headlamp. I also packed a loaded Glock 19. I always brought it with me when I went into the woods alone. I never had to use it, but it made me feel more secure. Animals or people, you never know. I left on a Thursday morning, around 9 a.m. It was already 83 degrees. I drove about 2.5 hours south past Ava, then down some rough Forest Service roads that barely looked used anymore. I was following directions I found on a camping forum. Some guy posted about a remote spot near an old fire road where you could camp right near a ridge overlooking a narrow creek. No trails, no signs, no traffic, just quiet woods. By the time I reached the general area, my truck suspension had taken a beating. I parked at a bend in the overgrown road, just a patch of flattened weeds that looked like someone had parked there once months ago. I got out, stretched, and looked around. No sound but bugs and birds. It was peaceful. I grabbed my pack and hiked about 15 minutes up a slight incline through mostly pine and oak. It wasn't too dense. You could see a fair distance between trees. I found the spot from the forum photo. Flat ground, a slight opening in the canopy, and maybe 30 feet away the ground dropped off into a narrow ravine. I could hear water trickling faintly. I set up my tent facing the ravine, laid out a small tarp where I could cook, and stacked a ring of rocks for a fire. I wasn't planning to make a fire that night unless it got chilly, which was unlikely. I mostly just wanted to relax. I boiled some water, made instant coffee, and sat for a while, listening to the wind in the leaves. The first night was uneventful. I walked a bit before dusk, just up and down the ridge, not going far. I saw a few deer in the distance, and once I thought I heard a wild pig snorting somewhere below, but I didn't spot it. I ate a simple meal, cleaned up, zipped into my tent, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional owl. Around 3 a.m., I woke up needing to pee. I unzipped the tent, stepped outside with my headlamp, and took a few steps away. The air was cooler, still, and damp. As I finished, I heard something in the distance. Not too close, but not far either. Something walking. It was subtle at first, like the sound of 1 or 2 heavy steps in dead leaves. Then nothing. I waited, not moving. Then a couple more steps. Then silence again. I stayed still for maybe a minute, then turned off the headlamp. My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing I could see. Eventually, I went back in the tent, zipped it shut, and sat there quietly, listening. Whatever it was had stopped. After a while, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I figured it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon rooting around. It didn't bother me much. I made breakfast and decided I'd explore a little farther down toward the ravine. I followed the slope, stepping over roots and rocks, careful not to slip. The creek was shallow but clear. Cold water ran gently over smooth stone. I crouched down, washed my face, and sat for a while with my feet in the water. Around noon, I hiked a bit upstream, found a mossy boulder to sit on, and just relaxed. I didn't see or hear anyone all day. No planes, no distant voices, nothing man-made. That was the best part, just being away from everything. I stayed there until the shadows started to stretch long across the forest floor. Then I made my way back. That night, as the sun went down, I made some eggs and sat watching the sky dim behind the trees. The air got still again. I noticed it had that heavy, silent feeling like before a storm, though the forecast hadn't called for one. As the stars came out, I zipped into my tent again and lay there with the rain fly off, staring up through the mesh. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly, not from a sound or movement, but just suddenly fully alert, like I had been nudged awake. My heart was already beating fast. I held still and listened. Then I heard it again. Steps in the leaves. This time closer, much closer. Not a deer. Too slow. Deliberate. One step. Two. Then a pause. Then another. It circled slowly to the left of my tent, maybe 20 feet out. Then it stopped. I sat up quietly and reached for the Glock near my foot. I clicked the safety off. No movement now, just crickets. Then I heard a small sound behind the tent, a faint scraping sound, like something brushing lightly against the nylon. I froze. It didn't continue. Nothing after that for a long time. I must have sat still for over an hour, listening. Eventually, I lay back down, gun on my chest. I never went back to sleep. By morning, nothing seemed out of place. I got out, checked the area around the tent. No tracks that I could see. The ground was dry, covered in dead leaves, and any prints would be faint. I did find a broken twig near the rear corner of the tent, freshly snapped. Could have been anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Someone had been there, someone watching. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to jump at shadows. Could have been an animal, maybe a bear. They do get curious. Still, I couldn't ignore the deliberate pacing, the slow steps. I kept the pistol holstered on my hip the rest of the day. I spent that afternoon closer to camp. Never strayed more than 50 yards. I tried to stay relaxed but alert. Every little sound had me turning my head. I didn't eat much, just some jerky and a protein bar. I sat with my back to a tree, eyes scanning constantly. That night, I didn't sleep. I laid in the tent, gun in hand, staring at the mesh ceiling, listening. Around 2 a.m., it started again. The same slow steps, but this time from farther off. I turned off the headlamp and slid silently to the tent door. I waited. I heard them again, about 30 feet out. Then nothing. Minutes passed. Then one loud crack. A branch snapped hard. My blood ran cold. I sat up, unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Total darkness. The forest was dead silent now. Not even insects. Suddenly, a small, sharp clack came from the cooking area, metal hitting rock. I knew that sound.
Mepan.
Something had picked it up and dropped it. I stood up, gun in hand, and stepped out slowly. I moved behind the tent, trying to stay in shadows. I crouched and waited, barely breathing. Then I saw it. A shape maybe 30 feet away. Not clear, but the silhouette of a person. Not big, not small. Just standing there, facing my camp. Still, unmoving. I raised the gun. I didn't say anything, just stood there with it aimed. My finger was on the trigger, but the figure didn't move. Then, after what felt like a full minute, it turned and walked slowly back into the woods.
No ruse.
Just walked away until I couldn't see it anymore. I stood there another 10 minutes before going back to the tent. I didn't pack. I didn't sleep. I just waited for the sun to come up. As soon as the light hit the trees, I packed everything fast. I didn't even eat. I hiked back to the truck in under 10 minutes. I kept checking behind me every few seconds. When I reached the road and saw my truck still there, untouched, I felt the first real breath of relief. I drove nonstop all the way home, heart still racing. I didn't stop until I was in my apartment with the door locked. I left the gear in the truck. A week later, I went back through the forum where I found the camping spot post. The user who posted about it hadn't logged in since last year. No responses to questions. I looked at his profile. He'd posted once about finding weird signs of someone living out there. Makeshift shelters, animal bones, a rusty axe leaning against a tree. I hadn't seen any of that, but maybe I hadn't gone far enough. I haven't been camping alone since. I sold most of my gear. I still go on hikes, but always in daylight and never. I went on a solo camping trip in early September 2019. I was 34 years old at the time, living in Spokane, Washington. I'd spent most of my adult life working as a mechanical inspector for a small local firm. It wasn't a bad job, just repetitive, and after 10 years of it, I'd gotten into the habit of taking small solo trips to disconnect from everything. No phone reception, no work emails, no noise. Just me, a tent, and some quiet. This time, I picked a new area, a patch of national forest near Priest Lake, Idaho. I'd heard it was remote, but not totally inaccessible. It was far enough from any major trails that I figured I wouldn't run into other people, but close enough to some logging roads that I could drive most of the way in. I spent a few hours studying the area on topo maps, packed enough food and water for 3 days, loaded up my old Nissan Xterra, and drove out on a Thursday morning. I parked on a narrow dirt road that cut through the forest. It wasn't an official trailhead or anything, just a turnoff where I could pull the vehicle partially into the brush and leave it hidden. I didn't want to make it obvious someone was camping nearby. I hiked for about an hour, mostly downhill through pine and spruce, thick moss covering everything in green. The ground was soft, and everything smelled like damp earth and dry wood. Eventually, I found a spot next to a creek. It wasn't big, just a few feet wide, but it ran fast and clear, and I could hear it from anywhere in my little clearing. That sound always helped me sleep. I set up my tent a few feet from the water, made sure it was on high ground in case of rain, and built a small fire pit from rocks I gathered nearby. I brought a compact gas stove for cooking, so I didn't need to collect wood or worry about keeping a big flame going, but I liked having a little fire in the evenings for warmth and comfort. That first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned chili, watched the light fade behind the trees, and went to sleep just after dark. No animals, no strange noises, nothing. I remember thinking it was one of the most peaceful nights I'd had out there in a long time. The next day, I did some basic exploring. I followed the creek upstream for a while, climbed a small ridge, and spotted some deer tracks in the mud. I didn't see any people or hear any distant vehicles. I was alone out there, which was exactly what I wanted. I came back to camp around 4 in the afternoon, made some ramen, and sat near the fire ring with a book until it got too dark to read. Then I crawled into the tent and zipped it shut. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. I didn't want to go far, so I stepped just a few feet out of the tent, used the edge of the creek, and stood there for a few seconds listening. The air was perfectly still. No wind, no insects, not even frogs. Just the water running past me. That quiet was what struck me. Even in the middle of nowhere, there's usually something making noise at night. Leaves shifting, branches creaking, the occasional coyote. But it was silent. I remember thinking it was strange, but I was half asleep, so I just zipped myself back inside and fell asleep again. The next morning, everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place. I ate some trail mix and a protein bar for breakfast and decided to head farther downstream. I wanted to find a wider section of the creek where I could maybe sit and soak my feet or skip rocks. I followed it for a good half hour before finding a little bend where the banks opened up. I took off my boots and socks, dipped my feet in the water, and just sat there. About 10 minutes later, I noticed something in the mud a few feet away. At first I thought it was another deer track, but when I got closer, it didn't look right. It was a boot print. Not a hiking boot, though, more like a work boot. Deep tread, fairly big, definitely made by someone heavier than me. I wear a size 10.5, and this print was clearly larger than mine. I crouched down to look at it. It was fresh. I could tell because the edges hadn't crumbled or dried out yet. It had to be from the last 12 hours. I hadn't seen or heard anyone. No camps, no voices, no fears. And this print wasn't heading up or downstream. It came straight out of the woods toward the creek and then disappeared. I looked around but didn't see any others, at least not in the soft mud. I felt my stomach tighten a little. It wasn't unusual to run into other campers or hunters in a place like this, but most people make some noise. And this boot print wasn't on any trail. It was in the middle of thick, uneven forest. I didn't want to overreact, so I walked back to camp, taking a slightly different route just to be sure I wasn't imagining anything. When I got there, everything was the same. My tent, my stove, my food, all untouched. I checked around the perimeter of my site for more boot prints. Nothing, just pine needles and packed dirt. I tried to forget about it, told myself it could have been an old track, maybe even my own from the day before that had shifted in the mud. Couldn't be sure. That night, I had a harder time falling asleep. I kept hearing small sounds outside, twigs snapping, a faint crunch of something in the distance. I told myself it was deer or raccoons. That's all it ever is out here. I didn't hear anything close to the tent, and eventually I drifted off. Then I woke up around 4:30 a.m. to a sharp, distinct sound, a heavy thud, like someone had dropped a piece of wood or stepped on a log. It was close. My ears were on high alert immediately. I didn't move. I just lay there, breathing slow, trying not to make a sound. A few seconds later, I heard it again. Thud, but farther off now, like whoever or whatever had made it was moving away. I stayed perfectly still for another hour until the sun came up. Then I got out, checked the area, and saw something that made my skin crawl. A few feet from my tent, there was a line in the dirt. It wasn't a boot print this time. It looked like someone had dragged a stick or a branch in a half circle around part of my campsite. It wasn't there the night before. It started near the creek, cut close to the tent, and curved around toward the trees on the other side. I followed it for a few feet until it just stopped. That was it for me. I packed everything as fast as I could. No breakfast, no coffee, nothing. Just shoved the tent into my pack, stuffed the sleeping bag in without rolling it, and slung the bag over my shoulders. I had about a mile hike back to the Xterra, and I moved faster than I ever had in my life. Every little noise made me whip my head around. I kept thinking about that boot print and the line in the dirt. Someone had been watching me. That much I was sure of. When I got to the car, I noticed something else that turned my stomach. The passenger door wasn't fully closed. I was sure I'd shut all the doors when I left. I always do. I checked the interior. Nothing missing, nothing moved, but the glove box was open. I didn't leave it that way. I hadn't even opened it on this trip. I got in, locked all the doors, and drove straight out of the forest, only stopping when I hit pavement again. I didn't relax until I was back in Spokane. Even then, I kept thinking someone might have followed me. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. It just felt too strange, like something people would think I made up or was exaggerating. But I know what I saw. That boot print wasn't mine. The noise outside the tent wasn't an animal, and the line in the dirt wasn't natural. Someone was out there, not camping, not hiking, just watching. I never went back to that part of the forest. I started taking shorter trips to more popular areas, places where I knew other people would be nearby. It wasn't the solitude that scared me. It was realizing that out in the woods, you're not as alone as you think. Not always. And whoever was out there that night, they knew exactly how to move without being seen. That thought still gets under my skin. I was lucky. Nothing happened. I got out. But it taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Out there, it's not bears or wolves you need to worry about. It's people. The kind who stay just out of sight. The kind who don't make a sound. The kind who draw a line around your tent in the dark and walk away like it's a game. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 32 back then, living in Columbus, Ohio, working a job that felt more draining than rewarding. The constant buzz of the city, the endless work emails, and the gray cubicle walls were starting to eat at me. I wasn't exactly in a bad place, but I needed a break. I wanted to hear nothing but wind in the trees and the sound of my own footsteps. That's all. So I picked a spot up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, far enough to be out of reach, but close enough that I could drive there in a day. The spot I chose was in Ottawa National Forest. I'd read about it online. Massive trees, scattered lakes, and very few people. That was the appeal. It wasn't one of those busy campgrounds with neatly drawn plots and loud RVs. This was dispersed camping, which meant I could set up wherever I wanted, as long as I followed the rules. I packed my gear, filled my cooler, and set out just before sunrise on a Friday. The drive took about 10 hours. I reached the forest just before dark, bouncing down miles of dirt roads lined with nothing but trees. I found a clearing near a small lake that was completely empty. There were no signs of other campers, no trash, no footprints, nothing. It looked untouched. That was perfect. I parked my Subaru on a slope just off the trail and set up camp under a cluster of tall pines. My tent was a basic two-person model I'd used a few times before. I laid down a tarp, staked it out, and set up my sleeping bag inside. I got a fire going before it got too dark and made a simple dinner. Some pre-cooked chicken and vegetables I'd brought in foil packs. As I sat there eating by the fire, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Quiet. Not just silence, but quiet in my head. No pressure.
No timelines.
Just the soft crackle of fire and the distant creak of trees. That first night, I slept well. A little cold, but not bad. I woke up around 6 a.m. with a little dew on my tent and some condensation inside, which was normal. I made coffee on my small stove and ate a granola bar, then hiked around the lake for a few hours. The water was perfectly still.
No bugs. No sounds.
Just my boots crunching through the underbrush. I found a few animal tracks by the shore, maybe deer or elk. I followed a narrow trail deeper into the woods, but didn't go too far since I hadn't marked my path and didn't want to get lost. That afternoon, I gathered more wood, read a bit by the fire, and even took a short nap in my hammock. It was the most peaceful day I'd had in years. That evening, I made another fire, cooked some sausage and beans, and watched the sunset over the lake. I remember thinking, I could stay out here for a week, easy. But something shifted that night. I was lying in my sleeping bag, just drifting off, when I heard movement outside. It wasn't a loud noise, not like branches snapping, but more like a steady crunching. Something walking. I opened my eyes and froze. My first thought was deer, maybe a raccoon. I listened, trying not to move or make a sound. The steps were heavy, not like a raccoon. I slowly reached for the flashlight next to me but stopped. The steps paused. Then I heard them again, moving around the tent. Not running, not panicked, just slow, deliberate walking. I stayed perfectly still. My heart was racing. I told myself it was just a big animal, a moose maybe or a bear. But bears don't usually walk around tents like that. They come straight in or move on. I didn't hear any sniffing or grunting, just footsteps. Eventually, the sound moved away. I waited for a long time before I even dared to sit up. I didn't go outside. I just stayed in the tent, flashlight in hand, until sleep finally took me some time before dawn. The next morning, I stepped out carefully. Everything looked the same. I walked the perimeter of the site. I didn't see any tracks. The ground was mostly pine needles, so that made sense. But the uneasy feeling stuck with me. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe curious about the food smell. Still, I packed my gear into the car just in case. I figured I'd do one more night, but if anything else felt off, I'd leave early. I drove out to a general store about 20 miles away to grab more water and a few snacks. When I got back a few hours later, I noticed something strange. A small stack of rocks had been built near my fire ring. 3 stones, balanced vertically. I hadn't made that. I would have remembered. I looked around again. Still no sign of people. No vehicles. Nothing disturbed. But that little pile of rocks didn't sit right with me. I thought maybe it was there before and I just missed it. I knocked it over just to be sure and sat back by the fire, trying not to overthink it. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I kept listening for movement. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Same pattern. Slow. Circling the tent. I held my breath. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like breathing. Not loud but steady. Like someone standing just a few feet from the tent wall. I felt the air shift like someone exhaling near the fabric. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I waited. It stopped. No footsteps this time, just silence. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed. But at some point I blacked out from exhaustion. In the morning, I was done pretending it was nothing. I packed everything fast. I didn't eat. I didn't make coffee. I tossed my gear into the car without rolling it up properly. As I was zipping up the tent for the last time, I noticed something scratched lightly into the fabric near the bottom. 3 small horizontal slashes. Not deep, just surface cuts. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I got in the car and started driving out. The road was narrow, winding through thick forest. About 10 minutes in, I had to slow down for a fallen branch. It wasn't huge, but it was big enough that I had to get out and move it. I left the engine running and walked around to the front. That's when I saw it. Off the road, maybe 20 feet into the trees, there was something. Not a person, not an animal, a structure, a rough shelter made from logs and branches. It was low, barely tall enough to crouch inside. From where I stood, I could see a pile of cloth or maybe blankets inside. I stared for a long time, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't a hunter's blind. It looked lived in. There was a plastic water bottle near the entrance and what looked like the burned-out remains of a small fire pit. I didn't go any closer. I backed up slowly, got in the car, and drove around the branch. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I hit pavement almost 40 minutes later. I pulled over at a gas station in a tiny town and sat there for a long time. I didn't call the police. I didn't know what to say. There was no crime, no person, no threat I could prove. But I knew what I felt. Someone had been watching me. Someone had walked around my tent, breathed near it, left marks, maybe followed me back from the lake that first day. I never camped alone again after that. I tried a few years later with friends. But even then, I couldn't relax. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for footsteps that weren't there. I think about that shelter sometimes, about who lived there, why they never showed themselves, why they only walked at night. I wonder how many other campers came through and never noticed, how many didn't hear the breathing. But I was lucky. I left before anything worse happened. That's what I tell myself. And maybe that's true. I never went back to Ottawa National Forest. I still hike. I still love the outdoors. But now I stick to busy trails, crowded campsites, places with cell signal, places with other people. I miss that peace I felt on the first day. But peace like that isn't worth the feeling I had the last night. The feeling of being watched not by an animal or a ghost, but by someone real, someone close, someone who never said a word. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. I had always found solace in nature, the rustling leaves, the chirping birds, and the wind whispering through the branches. But today something felt off. I was alone, standing in a small clearing in the woods, just a few miles from the nearest town. It was the first time I had gone camping by myself in a long time, and I had chosen this spot because it seemed peaceful and isolated, far from the usual camping sites with all the noise and people. My name is Tom. I'm 29, and I've been camping since I was a kid. It's one of the few things I do to clear my head, to forget about the stresses of work, bills, and everything that comes with adult life. I've always enjoyed being out here, surrounded by the scent of pine and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. But today it was different. The air felt thicker, heavier, and it wasn't just the humidity. Something about this place made my skin crawl, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I had set up camp near a small creek, which added a soothing backdrop of water flowing over smooth rocks. I dropped my bag by the tent, taking a moment to look around. The trees here were tall, their trunks wide and dark, their branches stretching high into the sky. The sun had already started dipping behind them, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was cool, and the day was fading quickly. The plan was simple: a few days alone to decompress. No distractions, just me, the woods, and the silence. I had made sure to bring everything I needed: food, water, a sleeping bag, and the usual camping gear. I set up the tent quickly, a small two-person tent that I could manage easily by myself. I didn't need much, just a place to sleep and a way to stay warm. Once the tent was set, I started a small fire using the dry wood I had gathered from the forest floor. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the night air. I sat by it for a while, watching the flames dance. There was a peace in the flickering light, and for a few minutes, I forgot about that strange feeling that had settled in my chest. I roasted a couple of marshmallows, then decided to turn in early, knowing I'd want to get up early for a hike the next day. The tent was comfortable enough, and the sound of the creek outside my tent was calming. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the occasional rustling of the leaves in the wind. It wasn't long before I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the quiet of the night. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't the kind of wake-up where you slowly come to consciousness. It was immediate, as if something had shocked me awake. My heart was racing, and my breathing was shallow. I didn't know what had caused it, but the feeling of unease was back. My eyes darted around the inside of the tent, but everything looked normal. The only sound was the steady rush of the creek. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the result of too much caffeine earlier in the day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible, and peered outside. The fire was still burning weakly, casting flickering shadows against the trees. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that felt wrong. There was a distinct heaviness to the air now, almost as if something was pressing down on the forest. I stood there for a few minutes, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. After a while, I zipped the tent back up, crawled into my sleeping bag, and tried to convince myself to relax. But sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, eyes wide open, listening to every little sound: the rustle of branches, the creak of trees swaying in the wind, the sound of water moving over rocks. The shadows outside the tent seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, but it was fitful, full of strange dreams that I couldn't remember. When I finally woke up, the first light of dawn was filtering through the trees. The woods were still, but the uneasy feeling hadn't left. It was almost like the night had never ended. I decided to pack up and go for a walk to clear my head. I wasn't about to let a bad night ruin my trip. I made a quick breakfast of granola and coffee, packed up my gear, and set out on a trail that I had passed the day before. It wound its way through the trees, following the creek upstream. I figured a walk might help me shake off the weird vibe from the night. The morning was crisp, and the woods were quiet. The sunlight was just starting to filter through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and clean. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made me jump. I'd been in these woods plenty of times before, but this was different. This time, I felt like I didn't belong here. I pushed forward, trying to ignore the growing anxiety in my chest. After about an hour of walking, I found a spot by the creek and sat down on a rock to take a break. I reached for my water bottle and took a sip, trying to calm myself. The sound of the water rushing over the rocks was soothing, but it didn't seem to help. The more I listened, the more I felt like I could hear something just beyond the trees, something that wasn't quite right. It was when I stood up to leave that I noticed it. A small, flat stone near the edge of the creek had been moved. It wasn't in its original position. It had been shifted, slightly askew. At first, I thought it might just be the result of the water, but then I saw another rock nearby that had also been disturbed. I looked around, my heart pounding. There was no sign of any animal tracks, no indication that the rocks had been moved by anything natural. I took a step back, scanning the trees. The unsettling feeling returned in full force. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was wrong. The woods around me suddenly felt much larger, as if they were closing in. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe someone had been here before me, another camper, perhaps. But then I remembered I was the only one around. This area was far off the beaten path, and no one else had been registered at the campsite. I turned and quickly made my way back to the trail, trying to keep my breathing steady. But every step seemed to echo too loudly, and the silence around me was deafening. The woods felt suffocating now, like they were pressing in from all sides. My eyes darted to every shadow, every movement in the trees, but I saw nothing. I finally reached my campsite again, and the first thing I noticed was that my fire pit was no longer as I had left it. The firewood I had gathered was scattered, and the small fire I had left burning was now just a pile of smoldering embers. Someone had been here. Someone had tampered with my campsite. I froze, my heart racing, my mind trying to process what had just happened. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anyone, but someone had been here. I could feel it. I'd been looking forward to this weekend for months. My name's Eric, and I was 26 years old at the time, living in a small apartment on the edge of town. My friends and I had been planning a camping trip for a while, hoping to escape the stress of work and just enjoy some time away from it all. We'd chosen the Silver Creek Campground, a secluded spot about 3 hours north of the city, tucked away in the dense forests of the Appalachian Mountains. The place had a reputation for its beauty, with crystal-clear streams, rolling hills, and towering trees. It seemed perfect for a weekend of hiking, fishing, and relaxing by the fire. It was early October when we set off. The weather was crisp, the kind of cool, fresh air that made you feel alive and eager to breathe deeply. I packed up my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, a few beers, and met up with my friends. John, who was a few years older than me and had a calm, quiet demeanor. Claire, a fiery redhead who worked in marketing. And Tom, who was always the first one to crack a joke or make fun of someone, but in a way that always lightened the mood. We met at the parking lot near the trailhead and unloaded our stuff. The forest around us was dense, the trees thick with leaves that hadn't yet fallen. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting shadows on the ground. The air smelled earthy, a combination of wet leaves, pine, and fresh air. It was the kind of place that made you feel both small and safe at the same time. We hiked for about an hour, following a narrow dirt path that wound its way through the woods. The trail wasn't particularly difficult, but it was enough to get the blood pumping, especially with the incline here and there. As we walked, we joked about the things we'd forgotten to bring. John's forgetfulness was notorious, and the things we were looking forward to: fishing by the creek, cooking over the fire, and maybe even taking a dip in the cool water. The sun was still high, and the temperature was perfect, so I couldn't imagine anything going wrong. When we arrived at the campsite, it was just as beautiful as I had imagined. The site was set near a small clearing by the creek, with a large flat area perfect for tents. The sound of the water flowing over rocks filled the air, creating a peaceful, soothing background noise. The trees formed a protective canopy overhead, and the ground was soft with layers of pine needles. There was a small fire pit already in place, with a ring of stones around it, and a couple of old logs for sitting. It was an ideal spot, and we wasted no time in setting up camp. We pitched the tents, set up our cooking area, and gathered wood for the fire. By the time we were done, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting the forest in a golden light. Tom, as usual, was the first to start making jokes, but I could tell he was also in a bit of awe. This was, after all, one of those places that seemed to hum with quiet energy. The fire crackled to life as the evening settled in. We sat around it, sharing stories, drinking a few beers, and cooking our dinner. The air was getting cooler, but the fire kept us warm. The conversation flowed easily, and we all felt relaxed and comfortable. The sounds of the forest seemed distant, and everything felt normal. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but I now realize how peaceful it was. Too peaceful, almost as if the place were holding its breath. That night, after we finished eating, we sat in front of the fire for a while longer, staring into the flames and listening to the occasional snap of a branch in the forest. The stars were clear in the sky, and there wasn't a cloud in sight. It was one of those perfect, still nights where you can't help but feel like everything is exactly as it should be. Around midnight, we decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself in, and settled into my sleeping bag. The night was so quiet that it almost felt unnatural. The usual sounds of nocturnal creatures, the rustling of leaves, the chirp of crickets were absent. For a moment, I felt a brief unease, but I brushed it off. I'd been camping plenty of times before, and this was just another night in the woods. I closed my eyes and let the rhythmic sound of the creek lull me to sleep. But I didn't sleep for long. I woke up in the middle of the night, around 3 a.m. At first, it was just the subtle shift of waking from a deep sleep, but then I noticed something off. It was too quiet. The creek's usual gentle flow had stopped. There was no wind rustling the trees. Nothing. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I lay there in the dark, straining to hear anything. Any sign that things were as they should be, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My thoughts raced, and I found myself suddenly anxious. The feeling of unease I'd brushed off earlier now felt very real. After a few minutes, I decided to get up. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I should check things out and calm myself down. I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, looking around the campsite. The fire had long since burned out, and there was no light anywhere. It was pitch black, and I couldn't even see the outline of the trees just a few feet away. I squinted into the darkness, my breath visible in the cold air, and saw nothing, just blackness. Felt wrong. Something about the stillness made the forest feel like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The sensation of being watched crept over me. I stood there for a few seconds, my pulse quickening. I was about to crawl back into the tent when I heard it. A soft crack, like a twig breaking in the distance. My head snapped toward the sound. I couldn't see anything, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It sounded too deliberate. For a few seconds, I stood frozen, my eyes darting around, trying to catch any movement in the dark. But there was nothing. I took a deep breath and tried to shake the unease from my mind. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was nothing. I didn't want to freak myself out. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A distinct crunch of something stepping on the forest floor. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wasn't alone out there. My mind raced. Was it a bear? Maybe a deer? But there was something unsettling about the way the sounds came, so deliberate and purposeful. It wasn't the casual rustling of a typical forest animal. I hurried back into my tent and zipped it up tight, trying to steady my breathing. I lay there, wide awake now, straining to listen. The sounds from outside had stopped. There was nothing but the oppressive silence. I felt my fear grow with each passing second, but I tried to remind myself that it was probably just my imagination. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though sleep didn't come easy. When I woke up the next morning, the forest felt normal again. The creek was flowing, the birds were singing, and the sun was already high in the sky. I felt foolish for letting my mind get the better of me, but something lingered in the back of my mind. The day went on without incident. We hiked along the creek, did some fishing, and even made a small hike up the nearby hill to take in the view. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every now and then, I'd look over my shoulder, convinced that someone or something was watching us. I kept my concerns to myself, not wanting to ruin the mood for everyone else. Besides, they didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. That night, we sat around the fire again, but this time, I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about the strange sounds from the night before. My mind raced with possibilities. Someone else was out there in the woods, maybe another camper who'd gotten lost, or someone who wasn't supposed to be here. but I couldn't be sure. Around midnight, I decided to stay up a little longer than usual. I wanted to listen to make sure I wasn't just imagining things. The forest was quieter than it had been the night before, and my nerves were on edge. I kept telling myself I was being irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, at around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it was unmistakable. The sound of something moving through the underbrush, snapping twigs, approaching the camp. My heart jumped into my throat, and I froze. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there. I wasn't sure what to do. I could wake up the others, but what if we were just overreacting? What if it was nothing? But I couldn't ignore it any longer. I decided to leave the tent and investigate. I crept out of my tent slowly, making sure not to make any noise. The fire had long since died, leaving only the faint glow of embers. The night was colder than before, and the air felt thick with tension. As I stepped away from the camp, I could hear the sound again. It was closer now, but it wasn't moving quickly. It sounded like it was circling us, deliberately staying just out of sight. I made my way to the edge of the clearing and crouched down, trying to stay hidden. The sound of movement was just on the other side of the trees, so close I could almost reach out and touch it. I held my breath, waiting for whatever it was to come into view, but it never did. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped completely. I stayed crouched, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as I... It was late September, and I had just moved into a small cabin in the mountains near Lake Ontario, not too far from where I grew up. The cabin itself was old, built sometime in the 1960s, but still solid. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find surrounded by dense forests and rocky hills, isolated but peaceful. The perfect place to disconnect for a few days. I was 32, living alone, and looking for some time away from the noise of city life. The cabin was rented through an online service, so I'd only seen a few photos. They looked charming enough. A small front porch with a couple of chairs, a view of the forest, and a wood stove in the living room. What more could I ask for? A quiet escape, some time to myself. I packed my things, books, a few snacks, my hiking boots, and set out for the drive. It was a 3-hour trip, and by the time I pulled up the gravel driveway and turned the engine off, the sun had already started to dip behind the trees. The air was cooler than I expected for late fall, and the forest around the cabin was silent, save for the rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't even hear the hum of insects or birds. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like something was waiting just beyond the trees. The cabin itself sat a little off the road, nestled between two massive oak trees. It was a 2-story structure with a steep roof and a stone chimney. The porch creaked underfoot as I stepped onto it, and I paused for a moment, taking in the stillness of the surroundings. There was no one for miles. I liked it that way. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and musty pine. The furniture was basic but comfortable. A couple of couches, a simple wooden table, a bookshelf filled with old novels. The windows were wide, allowing in a view of the forest that stretched out as far as the eye could see. It was perfect. I unpacked my bags, set up my things, and made myself comfortable. I didn't have any grand plans for the evening. Maybe a long walk through the woods, or I could just sit by the fire and read. That was the beauty of being out here, nothing but time to kill. As night began to fall, I lit the stove and grabbed a beer from the fridge. The fire crackled to life, and the room warmed up quickly. I sat on the couch, the book in my lap, but my mind kept wandering. There was something about the quiet here that felt unnatural. It wasn't the kind of peaceful silence you'd expect. Felt almost too still. The longer I sat there, the more it gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I pushed the thought aside and focused on the crackling fire. But as the hours passed, I noticed something that made my skin prickle, a soft creaking noise. At first, I thought it was the old wood of the cabin settling, but then I heard it again, followed by the distinct sound of something scraping against the floor. It was coming from upstairs. I froze. My heart rate picked up. The cabin was small, just a living room, kitchen, and a couple of bedrooms upstairs. I was the only one here, or at least I thought I was. I stood up slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or the house shifting, but the noise was too deliberate, too steady. Another creak, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure if I should go upstairs or just lock myself in the bathroom and wait for daylight. I tried to remind myself that it was probably nothing, maybe just an animal or the wind, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The steps stopped for a moment, and I waited, listening. The silence was deafening. Then, just as I thought it was safe, the sound started again. Only this time it was louder, closer. I turned toward the stairs. The low, dim light from the fire flickered across the wooden steps, casting strange shadows. I couldn't see anything clearly, but the footsteps were unmistakable. They were slow and heavy, like someone was walking up the stairs with purpose. I grabbed the first thing I could find, an old iron poker from the fire. It was heavy in my hand, cold to the touch. I felt like an idiot. What was I going to do? Confront whatever was up there with a fire poker? I forced myself to move. Quietly, I stepped toward the stairs, trying not to make a sound. Each creak of the floorboards beneath my feet felt like a scream in the dead silence of the cabin. I didn't want to know what was upstairs, but the feeling that I had to find out was stronger than my fear. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I paused, listening again. The footsteps had stopped. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I could hear something else now. A low, faint dragging sound, like something or someone was crawling across the floor above me. I swallowed hard. My mind raced, trying to come up with some logical explanation. Maybe there was another guest here, someone who had snuck in. But no, that didn't make sense. I'd seen the place when I arrived. There was no other car. The dragging noise stopped. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for what felt like an eternity, my heart hammering in my chest. The quiet was suffocating. I could almost hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. I took the first step up. It was solid, creaking beneath my weight. Slowly, I moved up one step at a time, the poker gripped tight in my hand. The sound of the dragging returned. Only this time it was much louder. It wasn't coming from the bedroom or the hallway. It was coming from the far end of the second floor, directly above the staircase. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I reached the top of the stairs. The hallway was dark, and the air felt cold. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to take a step forward, and then the sound stopped. I stood there, heart pounding, listening for any movement. I didn't know what to expect. What I saw next made my blood run cold. There, at the end of the hallway, just past the door to the bedroom, a figure stood in the dark. It was tall, thin, and draped in shadows, barely visible against the dim light of the cabin. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things, until it moved. It was a person, but the way they moved was all wrong. They shuffled forward slowly, their steps dragging across the floor. They were hunched over, as though in pain, and their clothes, ragged and old, hung loosely from their frame. I could see the outline of their face, pale and gaunt, their eyes wide and empty. I stumbled back down the stairs, my heart racing. The figure didn't follow, but I could hear the dragging noise again, moving closer, coming down the hall toward me. I turned and ran. The cabin was small, but it felt like miles. My breath was coming in short gasps as I slammed through the door and out onto the porch, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from whatever was in that cabin. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The sun had long since disappeared behind the mountains, leaving only a dim sliver of light on the horizon. The wind rustled the trees in an eerie, almost unnatural way, as if they were whispering secrets to each other. I had been looking forward to this weekend getaway, away from the stress of work and city life. But now, standing in front of the old cabin, I couldn't help but feel a creeping unease. It was supposed to be the perfect retreat. A simple cabin, tucked away in the dense woods of Northern California, just a few hours away from San Francisco. The kind of place you could go to reset, clear your head, and enjoy some solitude. I'd rented it online, a small, one-story structure surrounded by towering pines, with a rustic charm that seemed to promise peace and quiet. I could already imagine myself sitting by the fireplace, reading, and maybe even doing a little writing to get my thoughts in order. But now that I was standing there, the reality of the place felt different. The cabin looked much older in person. The weathered wood creaked and groaned with the wind, and the windows were small and dark, like the eyes of an animal watching from the shadows. I tried to shake off the feeling and told myself it was just nerves. After all, I had been in plenty of remote places before. This was nothing new. I opened the door, the hinges groaning as I pushed it inward. The interior was just as I had imagined, cozy, with wood floors, a stone fireplace, and an assortment of mismatched furniture that gave the place character. It smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, a scent that would have been pleasant if not for the way the air felt damp and stagnant. I set my bag down by the door, taking in the space. It was small, just one main room with a kitchen nook and a tiny bathroom off to the side. The bed was a simple, wooden frame with a thick quilt folded at the foot. Nothing fancy, but it would do. I made my way over to the fireplace, crouching down to inspect the stack of firewood nearby. It looked like enough to last a few nights, assuming I could get it lit. As I began unpacking my things, I noticed something odd. The place felt off. Not in a supernatural way, nothing like that, but more like it had been left untouched for a long time. The dust in the corners, the faint smell of mildew, the odd creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, it all seemed to add up to a sense of neglect. I had rented this place through a reputable site, but something about it made me second-guess my decision. I shrugged it off. It wasn't the first time I'd stayed in a rustic cabin, and the last time had been just fine. This would be no different, I told myself. As night fell, I lit the fireplace and settled in with a book. The crackling of the flames was comforting, and the warmth from the fire helped ease some of my discomfort. I made myself a simple dinner, some canned soup and crackers, and ate it quietly by the fire, the only sound being the occasional snap of wood in the hearth. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees. I could hear it battering against the walls, as though trying to break through. It was the kind of noise that made you feel small and insignificant, like nature itself was in a rage. I pushed it from my mind and focused on the book in my hands, but my eyes kept wandering to the shadows at the edges of the room. The flickering light from the fire cast strange shapes on the walls, and the longer I sat there, the more those shapes began to look like something else, something watching. I stood up, suddenly feeling the need to check the windows. I hadn't noticed earlier, but now I realized that they were all covered in grime, the glass hazy and streaked. I reached for the nearest one and wiped a hand across it, trying to clear some of the fog away. As I did, my reflection appeared, distorted and ghostly in the dim light. I recoiled for a moment, my heart racing. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I needed to relax, but then a sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like something scraping against the side of the cabin. My blood ran cold. I froze, holding my breath, listening intently. It wasn't the wind. This was something else, something deliberate. The sound was slow, rhythmic, like claws dragging along wood. Came again, and again. I moved cautiously toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe a wild animal, maybe some other camper, or maybe nothing at all. But the sound kept coming, and it was getting closer. My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made any sense. I grabbed the small flashlight I had packed and stepped cautiously outside. The air was colder now, the wind biting at my skin. I scanned the area, shining the beam of light in every direction. The trees swayed in the wind, casting long, thin shadows across the ground. Nothing moved. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, before I heard it again. The scraping sound. It was coming from the back of the cabin now, just beyond the small porch. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move toward it. Every step felt heavier than the last. When I rounded the corner, my flashlight caught something that made my blood run even colder. There, on the ground, were marks, deep, irregular gouges in the wood of the cabin's foundation. They were fresh, the edges still rough, as if something had been scraping at it just moments before. My mind raced. What could have made those marks? And why were they so close to the cabin? I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to believe that there could be something out there, but the fear in my chest told me otherwise. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, scanning the trees, listening for any sound, but everything was still. The scraping had stopped. I decided it was best to head inside. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, and made sure the fire was still going. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the wind outside, howling through the trees, and I kept imagining that scraping noise again. The thought that I wasn't alone in those woods gnawed at me, but I had to tell myself it was all in my head. The next morning, I woke to the smell of damp earth and the sound of birds chirping. The cabin was quiet again, as if nothing had happened the night before. I made myself some coffee, trying to shake off the unease, but it lingered, crawling just beneath the surface. I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. The woods around the cabin were dense and quiet, the ground soft beneath my boots. I didn't go too far, just far enough to give myself some distance from the cabin. I wanted to forget about the noises, forget about the strange marks on the foundation. But the farther I walked, the more I realized how isolated I was. There was nothing around for miles. No roads, no other cabins, no sign of civilization. I walked for hours trying to shake the feeling of being watched, but it never went away. The woods were silent, but in that silence, I felt the weight of something pressing in on me. Every crack of a twig, every rustling leaf made me jump. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. When I finally returned to the cabin, I was exhausted. My feet ached, and my mind was spinning with thoughts I couldn't control. I sat down on the couch, staring into the fire, trying to calm myself. But the unease was still there, creeping at the edges of my thoughts. That night, I decided to stay inside, lock the doors, and ignore the feeling of being watched. I spent the evening reading again, but it was hard to focus. My eyes kept darting to the windows, to the door, to the shadows at the edges of the room. I was about to turn in for the night when I heard it again, the scraping. But this time it wasn't just outside. It was coming from inside the cabin. My heart stopped. The sound was unmistakable now. It was coming from behind the walls. Something was inside the cabin. I ran to the door, grabbed the flashlight, and threw it open. There was nothing out there. The night was cold and still, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But I knew now something had been trying to get in. I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed my bag, rushed to the car, and left without looking back. The cabin, the woods, everything about it felt wrong. It wasn't the peaceful getaway I had imagined. It was something else, something darker. When I made it back to civilization, I didn't stop to look at the rental website again. I was done with cabins, done with remote places in the woods. Some things are better left unexplored. The marks on the cabin, the scraping sounds, the unease that had settled over me like a thick fog. I never found out what caused them, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back there. Not ever. The first time I saw the cabin, it looked like something out of an old photograph. Weathered wood, a rusty roof, surrounded by trees that seemed to have been standing long before the cabin was ever built. It was exactly what I needed. Quiet, isolated, far away from the demands of work and from the noise of city life. A place to clear my head, recharge, and get some rest. I had rented it for a week. The cabin was in the woods of central New Hampshire, tucked away on a private plot of land, miles away from the nearest town. There wasn't even cell service out there. The only thing I had was a map I'd printed from the rental website and the hope that I could make it there without any issues. I was in my late 20s, an introvert by nature, and the thought of being alone in the woods didn't scare me. It sounded perfect. I could read, write, maybe do some light hiking. There was a fireplace for the nights and a hammock on the porch where I could relax during the day. It was supposed to be peaceful and escape from everything. It took me almost 3 hours to get there, the winding roads getting narrower as I left the small town behind. The trees grew thick around me, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the only sounds were the occasional chirps of birds and the crunch of gravel under my tires. I could feel the isolation sinking in. The closer I got to the cabin, the more I was aware that I wouldn't see another person for the next week. That fact should have been comforting, but it didn't sit right with me. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a feeling. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not a single car in sight, not even a hint of smoke rising from a chimney. The cabin stood alone in a clearing surrounded by dense woods. There was an old stone path leading up to the front door, flanked by overgrown flower beds that must have been cared for years ago. The place looked forgotten, as though it hadn't been used in a long time. I took a deep breath, grabbed my bags, and went inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the smell of old wood and dust hit me instantly. The interior was just as I expected, rustic, but comfortable. A small kitchen to the right, a worn-out couch by the stone fireplace, a dining table with chairs, and a spiral staircase leading to a loft bedroom. It wasn't fancy, but it had what I needed. There were a few personal touches, old family photos, a couple of paintings, an antique-looking lamp in the corner. I set my things down and wandered around for a while, taking in the surroundings. The cabin had a heavy, quiet atmosphere, but it wasn't oppressive. More like a place that had seen a lot of time pass by. I figured I'd get used to it. By late afternoon, I had unpacked, and the sun had started to dip below the horizon. The wind had picked up too, carrying a chill with it. I made a fire in the stove to warm up, then settled in with a book. The storm clouds rolling in seemed to add to the heaviness of the air, but I still didn't feel too concerned. After all, it was just a storm. That evening, the wind outside howled against the windows, shaking the panes and sending eerie sounds through the trees. It was so quiet inside the cabin that I could hear every creak and groan of the old structure. The fire crackled, and I tried to focus on my book, but my thoughts kept wandering. Around 10 p.m., I heard a sound that made me set the book down. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a distinct knocking sound, soft but steady, like someone tapping on the wooden walls of the cabin. It was coming from the porch. I froze, staring at the door. It was such an odd sound, and for a moment, I thought it could be an animal, maybe a raccoon or something curious about the cabin. But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate. The knocking continued in slow, rhythmic intervals, each one a little louder than the last. I stood up, slowly, my mind racing. Who could be out there? There was no one for miles. I glanced out the window, but the rain and wind obscured my view of the porch. No one could be there, right? It didn't make sense. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I debated whether I should check. There was a part of me that told me it was probably nothing, just the wind playing tricks on me, or maybe some animal in the night. But another part of me urged caution. I wasn't familiar with the area, and there was something unsettling about the sound. It wasn't random. It was methodical. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. The sudden silence felt even more oppressive than the noise had. I took a few steps toward the door, heart pounding in my chest. There was a flashlight in my bag, and I grabbed it, then slowly approached the door, unsure of what I was about to find. I opened it cautiously and stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold air. The porch was empty. No one was there. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the darkness of the trees. The wind had calmed down a little, but the chill in the air seemed to intensify. I listened, hoping to hear the sound again, but it didn't come. After a while, I closed the door behind me and locked it. The knocking had stopped, but the unease lingered. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe a branch had fallen and hit the wall. Maybe the wind had caused something to tap against the wood. But none of those explanations seemed to make sense. It had been too purposeful. I went back upstairs to the loft, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The cabin felt too quiet now, almost suffocating. The wind had died down, but the night felt too still. The next morning, I woke up late. The sun was shining through the windows, and the storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and fresh. I tried to shake off the previous night's events, convincing myself it had been my imagination. There was no reason to be afraid. I was just tired, and the isolation was getting to me. But when I went downstairs, I noticed something strange. The doormat was askew, the edges curled up like it had been moved. I hadn't noticed it the night before, but it was out of place now. It wasn't much, just a small detail, but it set my nerves on edge again. I went out onto the porch, hoping the morning light would bring some comfort, but instead, I noticed something else. A single footprint, large and muddy, right in front of the door. It was fresh, probably from the night before. Someone had been out here. The cabin sat nestled in the woods, far from any sort of civilization. I had found it online as a remote getaway, just what I needed to disconnect for a while. A place to escape my hectic life, the constant pressure of work, and the overwhelming noise of the city. The photos had shown a cozy wooden cabin surrounded by towering trees, with nothing but nature for miles. It sounded perfect. I drove up late in the afternoon, the sun starting to dip behind the hills. The road leading to the cabin was narrow, unpaved, and barely wide enough for my car. My tires kicked up dust as I navigated the rough terrain. The trees lining the road loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their thick branches creating a canopy that blocked out much of the light. It felt like I was driving deeper and deeper into a forgotten part of the world. When I arrived, the cabin looked just as it did in the pictures. A small wooden structure, with a stone chimney that seemed to promise warmth, nestled among the tall pines. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up, and I unlocked the front door with the key the host had left for me. Inside, it was everything I had hoped for. Simple, rustic, with a stone fireplace and heavy wooden beams across the ceiling. The smell of old pine filled the air, a mix of earth and wood that was strangely comforting. I spent the first evening unpacking, setting my things down in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. It had a large window that looked out over a small creek that ran through the woods. I could hear the trickling water as I worked, which was a peaceful sound. The sun set early, casting long shadows across the landscape. The place was peaceful, still, and utterly quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirp of crickets. That night, I sat by the fireplace, the warm glow of the flames flickering in the hearth. I had brought a book to read, but the quietness of the cabin and the night outside kept pulling my attention. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Still, I couldn't ignore the hairs standing up on the back of my neck. The feeling only grew as the night deepened. I kept hearing small sounds outside, crunching leaves, twigs snapping, and something that sounded almost like a soft tapping on the walls. Each time I looked, the porch was empty. No animals, no other signs of life. Just the quiet woods stretching out in every direction. I tried to sleep, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. The bed was comfortable, but every creak of the house seemed amplified in the silence. The wind started to pick up, whistling through the trees and rattling the windows. But there was something else, something subtle like a shifting movement just outside the glass, just out of sight. It made my skin crawl, though I couldn't explain why. By the time the clock struck midnight, I had to get up. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly stepped outside onto the porch. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I scanned the woods with the beam of my flashlight, but there was nothing to see. Just the dark, empty trees, and the faint glow of the moon above. I stood there for a moment, listening. The sound of the creek, the wind rustling the leaves. It was peaceful, but there was an underlying stillness, a weight to the night that felt wrong. I stepped back inside and locked the door behind me. I sat in front of the fire for a while, trying to convince myself I was being foolish. But sleep eluded me. The sounds continued, subtle but persistent. Tap, 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 like something or someone was knocking gently on the outside of the cabin. Finally, exhausted and frustrated, I decided to sleep with the light on. I closed the blinds and curled up under the covers, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. It wasn't until the next morning that things began to feel even more unsettling. I woke early, the sunlight barely starting to break through the trees. I had barely slept, but there was no point in staying in bed. I decided to explore the woods around the cabin, to see if I could find anything that might explain the odd feeling I had been experiencing. I grabbed a jacket, some water, and my phone, and headed out the door. The woods were dense, but the path was easy enough to follow. I walked for a while, the ground soft under my boots, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves surrounding me. There were no signs of anything out of the ordinary. No strange tracks, no broken branches, no sign of anything that could have caused that feeling of being watched the night before. But as I walked deeper, the path narrowed. The trees grew closer together, and the quiet was absolute, except for the occasional chirp of an insect. I paused when I noticed something strange. A small pile of rocks arranged in a perfect circle. It was an odd thing to find in the middle of the woods. No signs of human activity were around, just the strange little circle. It didn't seem right. I crouched down, inspecting it closely. The rocks were worn smooth by time, weathered, but the circle was too perfect, too deliberate. I had heard of people creating rock formations in nature, but they were usually more random, less intentional. I reached out to touch one of the stones, and as my fingers brushed against it, a sudden chill ran through me. The hair on my arms stood up. I could feel the weight of something like a presence around me. It was as though the air had thickened. The stillness became oppressive. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. I glanced around, but the woods were as quiet as ever, the silence heavy and unbroken. Something in my gut told me to leave, so I turned and started walking back toward the cabin. I moved quickly, more quickly than I realized, like I had to escape something, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me again. I had no explanation for what I had felt or seen in the woods. The rational part of my brain kept telling me that it was just my imagination, that the isolation was messing with me. But there was something else, something I couldn't explain. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to distract myself. I read, I cooked, and I tried to settle in. But the quiet was no longer comforting. It was unnerving. Every little noise, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, the occasional rustle of the wind, seemed to be magnified. I kept expecting to hear the soft tapping on the walls again. By evening, the feeling had grown so intense that I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something in the house. I didn't know what it was, but the sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was overwhelming. I stayed up all night, listening, watching, but nothing happened. The night passed in eerie silence. The next morning, I packed up my things quickly. I didn't want to stick around any longer than necessary. The sense of dread was unbearable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that cabin, with that place. As I started the car and drove down the narrow road, the trees towering on either side of me, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But the road behind me remained empty. When I reached the highway and pulled out into the open, I let out a deep breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The weight lifted off my chest, and the air felt clearer, lighter. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I didn't think anyone would believe me, but I knew, deep down, that I would never return to that cabin again. Something had been there, something that I couldn't explain, something that would stay with me long after I left. The cabin was supposed to be my escape. I needed the solitude. The endless noise of the city had worn me thin. Traffic, people, the constant hum of electronics and life just moving too fast. I found the place on a cabin rental website, tucked away in the woods of Vermont, near a town called Westford. It seemed perfect, isolated, with no neighbors for miles, and a small but sturdy structure built out of weathered wood that gave it the look of something out of a postcard. I booked it for a week. When I drove up that evening, the sun was dipping low, casting golden light through the trees as I navigated the narrow road that led to the cabin. The air was already crisp, and the cool breeze made the trees sway, their branches creaking with every gust. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, taking in the stillness. There was no traffic, no honking horns, no voices, just the wind in the trees and the chirping of birds in the distance. The kind of quiet I had been craving. The cabin itself was older than I expected, but that only added to its charm. There was a large stone chimney on the side, the kind you'd expect to see in an old Western movie, and a porch with a couple of rocking chairs. The wood was dark with age, and the slanted roof looked like it had weathered countless storms. There was a small clearing in front of it, a few scattered patches of grass with a fire pit at the center. In the distance, the thick forest stretched out, a sea of green under the fading light of day. I grabbed my bag and went inside. The door creaked as I opened it, and the interior was just as rustic as the outside. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a few old armchairs set around it. The kitchen was small but well-equipped with an old wood stove, a fridge, and the bare essentials, just what I needed. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I explored the place. The air inside was a bit musty, like it hadn't been aired out in a while, but it wasn't unpleasant. It had character. I set my things down on the couch by the fire, which I lit to take off the chill. There was a comfortable feeling here, one that made me feel at ease, as though I could spend days just reading and cooking simple meals, letting the world pass me by. The peace was exactly what I needed. After unpacking, I made a cup of coffee and curled up on the couch with a book. The wind was picking up outside, rustling the trees in a soothing rhythm. I felt myself relax, my mind slowly letting go of the city stress. The fire crackled softly beside me, and the hours passed without me really noticing. I must have drifted off at some point, but I woke to the strange feeling of something being off. The fire had burned low, leaving only a few glowing embers. The room was cold now, and the wind outside had turned into a howl. I pulled the blanket tighter around myself, still half asleep, and glanced around the room. That's when I noticed the sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but I could hear it, scratching. A slow, deliberate sound, coming from somewhere upstairs. At first, I thought it might be the house settling, but then I heard it again, closer this time. Something moving, clawing at wood. I stood up, trying to shake off the sleepiness and the creeping sense of unease. My heart was beating a little faster now. The noise was definitely coming from upstairs, from the second floor. I had rented the cabin alone, and as far as I knew, there was no one else here. The staircase leading up was narrow and creaky. I made my way toward it, each step groaning under my feet. My fingers gripped the railing tightly as I climbed, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I didn't know why, but the closer I got to the top, the more I felt like something was wrong. At the top of the stairs, there was a small hallway with doors leading to two bedrooms. One of them was ajar, a sliver of darkness on the other side. The scratching sound had stopped, but I could still feel the tension in the air. I hesitated, then pushed the door open slightly. The room inside was dark, the faint light from the hallway barely reaching the far corner. There was nothing in there, just an old bed, a dresser, and a single window that looked out into the woods. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was silly, I thought, just the house settling, nothing more. I was just tired, letting my imagination get the better of me. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. The window, it was cracked open, just a small gap, enough to let in a little cold air. I was certain I hadn't opened it. I walked over to it and closed it, feeling a bit uneasy but trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. I went back downstairs, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that lingered in the back of my mind. The house was silent again, the only sound the wind outside. I stoked the fire again, hoping the warmth would make me feel better. But then the door to the back porch caught my eye. It was open, just a crack, enough that the wind was blowing in. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier when I arrived. I went over to the door, my footsteps suddenly slow and deliberate, and closed it again, locking the latch tightly. That's when I heard it again, a faint scratching sound. This time it came from outside. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or if it was something else, but the noise was there. It was coming from the porch or maybe just beyond it, hidden in the shadows of the trees. I couldn't bring myself to open the door again. I just stood there for a moment, listening, my breath coming out in short bursts, trying to decide what to do. The longer I stood there, the more I realized that I didn't want to be alone anymore. I didn't know why, but something about this place had started to feel wrong. The quiet was too quiet. The darkness outside, too thick. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was just past midnight. I couldn't go out now, not in the middle of the night, but I also couldn't stay here with the unsettling sounds creeping around the cabin. I decided to try and sleep. I locked the door again, checked the windows, and made my way upstairs, still listening for any signs of movement. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I didn't sleep well that night. I woke up early the next morning, the sunlight weak through the trees. The scratching had stopped, but the feeling of unease hadn't. I decided to take a walk in the woods, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The woods were thick and lush, the path winding through the trees. I kept my eyes on the ground, trying to ignore the occasional rustling from behind me. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. The tracks were the first thing I noticed. They were large animal tracks, but something about them didn't sit right. They were too deep, too large, for anything I'd seen around here. And the spacing between them was off, as if whatever had made them had been walking upright. I followed the tracks for a while, my unease growing with each step. The tracks led me to a clearing, and then they just stopped, as if the creature had vanished into thin air. I turned around and hurried back to the cabin, my heart racing. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt it now. The fear, the presence I couldn't explain. When I arrived, I was greeted by the sight of the back door wide open again. I swore I had closed it when I left. This time, I didn't close it. I locked it and stayed inside, listening to the wind howl outside, knowing I wasn't alone anymore. The first night I spent in the cabin was one I'll never forget. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. I had booked the place online, not far from the small town of Green Ridge, tucked away in the mountains. I had spent years working nonstop, taking on more than I could handle, barely catching my breath, and I thought it was finally time to escape, time to disconnect. No distractions, no phone, no internet, just nature and quiet. What could go wrong? I had seen the cabin in the pictures. Cozy, rustic, a little weathered but in a charming way. It looked like the kind of place you could sit in front of a fire, sip on coffee, and just relax. The owner had been quick to respond to my inquiry, and I'd gotten an address and simple directions. It was located a few miles outside of Green Ridge, tucked in a thick patch of woods. Perfect for what I needed, solitude. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had taken longer than I expected, the winding roads cutting through dense woods that seemed to go on forever. There were only a few houses scattered along the way, and even those looked abandoned. I had passed a small creek that was barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention, and then the path leading to the cabin appeared. It was unpaved, barely wide enough for my car to pass, and surrounded by towering trees. The cabin itself was even smaller than I'd expected. There was a front porch with a couple of old rocking chairs, a single story with a steep roof, and a brick chimney that, from the looks of it, hadn't been used in years. The wooden exterior was painted a faded red, the kind that you might see in an old photograph from the 60s. I wasn't put off by it, though. In fact, it gave the place character. I had done my best to ignore the little feelings of doubt creeping in. Was it too isolated? Too quiet? But I dismissed them. After all, it was just me, and I had come to find peace. I unloaded my car and set up inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust, but not in a bad way. Felt lived in, comfortable. There was a small living room with an old couch that faced a brick fireplace, and a tiny kitchen to the left. I checked the kitchen first. Old wooden cabinets, a small stove, and a fridge that hummed quietly in the background. There was a window that looked out to the forest. I opened it for a moment and let the cool mountain air drift in. The smell of pine trees was refreshing. I went out back to explore, but the moment I stepped outside, I was hit with the absolute stillness of the place. It was different from any other place I'd been. Normally, there are sounds, birds, wind, maybe a car driving by, but here, it felt like everything had been swallowed up by the woods. No traffic, no people, no animals, just silence. It was unnerving at first, but I figured I'd get used to it. As the sun began to set, I sat in one of the rocking chairs on the porch and watched the sky turn from orange to purple. The peacefulness was almost too much to bear. I could hear the faint creak of the cabin settling, the soft rustling of leaves in the trees, but it was almost as if the world had quieted down just for me. I didn't have any particular plans for the night. I figured I would light a fire, have dinner, and relax. The night was darker than I expected, though. I had grown so used to city lights that it took me a while to adjust to the pitch black that surrounded the cabin. I lit the fireplace, and for a while it was warm and cozy. I made a quick dinner and spent the rest of the evening reading a book I had brought. Around 9 p.m., I decided to head to bed. The bedroom was small but comfortable. There was a queen-sized bed with an old wooden frame, a dresser, and another window. The walls were lined with shelves of books and some old knickknacks. I didn't mind. It was a simple, unpretentious room, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally unwind. I turned off the lights, crawled into bed, and fell asleep quickly. That was when the noise started. It was soft at first, almost like a tapping sound. I thought I had imagined it, but it was persistent, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. I lay still in bed, listening. There it was again. Tap, 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 soft but steady. I got up and peered out the window, but there was nothing, just darkness. Could have been an animal. Maybe a tree branch tapping against the window, or maybe it was the wind. I tried to rationalize it, but the sound kept going. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random like the wind. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer next to the bed and cautiously made my way to the front door. My heart was pounding in my chest. The sound had stopped by now, but I felt the need to check. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and shined the light around. The beam cut through the darkness, catching only the shadows of trees and the faint outline of the porch. Nothing was there. I shook my head, feeling silly. It was probably just an animal. I went back inside, locked the door, and crawled back into bed, determined to sleep. But the tapping came again. Louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Right outside the cabin. I jumped out of bed, feeling a sense of panic creeping in. I grabbed the flashlight again and went to the door. I swung it open and stood in the doorway, scanning the area with the beam. The trees loomed tall around me, their silhouettes stark against the night sky. The wind rustled through the leaves, but nothing else moved. The tapping was gone. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, before I reluctantly closed the door and locked it. I couldn't sleep after that. Every little sound seemed amplified. The creak of the cabin settling, the occasional shift of a branch in the wind, but nothing more. No tapping. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, the silence almost suffocating. The next morning, I woke up tired, but I figured I could chalk it up to the nerves. I had never been alone in such an isolated place before, and the dark, quiet woods had probably gotten to me. I went about my day, making breakfast and going for a long walk through the trees. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I was feeling better. The sun had come out, and the light filtering through the trees was beautiful. That night, though, something happened again. The tapping returned. But this time, it wasn't just tapping. It was scratching. It was coming from beneath the cabin. Couldn't ignore it. My heart was pounding again as I stood near the door, flashlight in hand. The sound was low, but distinct. The kind of sound you don't forget once you hear it. I opened the door cautiously and shone the light down toward the foundation of the cabin. There was nothing there. I stepped out, my flashlight dancing over the ground, trying to find the source of the noise. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a raccoon? A possum? But the sound was too deliberate, too loud. And then I saw it. The ground beneath the cabin wasn't solid. There was a slight depression, a small hole where the dirt had shifted. I had missed it before, but now it was clear. There was something there. Something had been moving under the cabin. I didn't know what to do. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, and sat on the couch. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the feeling of being watched, the feeling that something was just beneath the surface, wouldn't go away. The tapping and scratching continued through the night, but by morning, it had stopped. I decided to leave the cabin the next day. I packed my things, threw everything into the car, and drove off, my mind still racing. I didn't want to believe anything strange had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling of something lurking beneath the cabin. Later, when I returned to Green Ridge and mentioned the cabin to the locals, I found out that it had been abandoned for years. The last tenants had left suddenly, after only staying for a week. No one knew exactly why. The owner, he didn't live around here. I couldn't help but wonder if they had heard the same sounds I did. But in the end, I realized it didn't matter. I had left the cabin and I wasn't going back. The silence that had drawn me there had been more unsettling than peaceful. And whatever had been under that cabin, whatever had been making those noises, stayed there. It wasn't my problem anymore. The cabin was supposed to be my refuge. I was tired of city life, the noise, the constant rush, the people, and just needed some time alone to clear my mind. I found the perfect spot, tucked away in the woods near a small town in Vermont, a place I had never heard of before. The cabin was small, old, but sturdy, surrounded by thick trees and a quiet stillness that made me feel like the world was miles away. I had rented it for a week, thinking I would just hike, read, and enjoy the solitude. A week to breathe and forget everything that had been stressing me out. I arrived on a Thursday evening, just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, with a chill that made the trees sway gently in the breeze. The road to the cabin had been winding and narrow, with the woods closing in on both sides, but I had made it without any trouble. The place seemed almost perfect. The cabin had that rustic charm that looked like it belonged in a postcard, the kind of place you might find in a tourist brochure about the perfect getaway. There was an old stone chimney, a wooden porch with a rocking chair, and large windows that looked out over a small clearing. Inside, the cabin was cozy, filled with old furniture. Nothing fancy, but it was clean, and that was enough for me. There was a small kitchen with an old wood stove, a fireplace, and a couple of comfortable chairs by the hearth. I settled in quickly, unpacking my bags and starting a small fire in the stove. It was cold enough that I was glad for the warmth. The crackling sound of the fire and the quiet outside made everything feel peaceful. I made some coffee, curled up with a book, and let the hours pass without thinking about anything else. The kind of peaceful evening I had hoped for. But as the night wore on, I started noticing things. The cabin creaked in ways I didn't expect. Old houses do that, of course, but there was something unsettling about the way this one sounded. The floors groaned as if something heavy was moving upstairs, though I knew I was alone. The wind outside began to pick up, rustling the trees and howling through the cracks in the windows. At first, I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the cabin's age. But then I heard something else, a faint scratching sound, like claws running along wood. It wasn't coming from the trees outside, but from somewhere inside the cabin itself. I stood up, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe an animal in the walls or something just settling in the house. But the sound continued, getting louder, closer. I moved slowly toward the stairs, which led to the second floor, trying not to make a sound. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to check. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed. I don't know why I was so afraid, but I had the strange feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. Reaching the top, I hesitated at the landing. The door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of darkness beyond it. The scratching noise had stopped, but the tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. I pushed the door open, expecting to see a mouse or some other small creature. But the room was empty, nothing was out of place, and there was no sign of anything that could have made that noise. I stood there for a few moments, my breath coming out in shallow gasps, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Maybe I was just tired. I hadn't been getting enough sleep recently. I decided to go back downstairs and try to relax again. I made another cup of coffee and curled up on the couch, the fire crackling beside me. It didn't take long before I drifted off into a restless sleep, the sounds of the wind and trees outside filling the background. I woke up hours later, disoriented and unsure of what had disturbed my sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was cold. As I rubbed my eyes and looked around, I noticed something strange. The door to the cabin's back porch was wide open. I was certain I had closed it earlier. I had made sure of it when I came inside, yet now it was open, letting in a cool draft. I walked over to it, unsure whether I was more tired or scared, but the wind was howling now, and the trees outside seemed to sway more violently than before. I closed the door, locking it firmly. But as I turned back around, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, movement, just at the edge of the window. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. Slowly, I walked to the window, my eyes scanning the dark yard outside. Nothing, just the trees, just the shadows. The feeling didn't go away, though. There was something wrong. Something was off. The peacefulness of the cabin had started to feel fake, as if everything was too quiet, too still. The longer I stayed there, the more I felt like I was being watched. The next morning, I went for a hike, trying to clear my head. The woods were beautiful, the trees so thick I felt like I was in a different world. The path was winding and narrow, but it was well-trodden, and I enjoyed the silence of it. I walked for hours, eventually coming across a small stream where I sat down to rest. It was here that I noticed the tracks. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, maybe a deer or a bear, but the more I looked at them, the more uneasy I felt. The prints were large, too large for any normal animal I knew of, and the way they were spaced apart made it seem as if whatever had left them was walking upright. I followed the tracks for a while, but they eventually led me to a clearing where they just stopped. No more prints, just the dirt, undisturbed except for those strange marks. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, or worse, watched. I made my way back to the cabin quickly, not bothering to enjoy the surroundings anymore. When I returned, everything seemed normal again. The cabin was as I left it, the air still and quiet. But when I went inside, I noticed something strange. A large patch of dirt on the floor near the back door. It wasn't there when I left. I didn't know what to think anymore. My rational mind was trying to convince me that it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, made sure the fireplace was safe, and stayed up late, waiting. I don't know what I was waiting for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. Eventually, I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. When I woke up in the morning, everything was quiet again. The door was still locked, the windows intact. I found a note on the kitchen counter, written in a hand I didn't recognize. "Leave while you still can." I packed my bags, left the cabin, and drove back to the nearest town without looking back. It took me weeks to shake the unease, and even now, whenever I think about that place, I can't help but feel like something was waiting there for me. Something that I never fully understood. I had never been the outdoorsy type. I preferred the comfort of city life. Constant motion, busy streets, and the hum of traffic that always made me feel like I was part of something bigger. But when my cousin Danny invited me to his remote cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway, I thought it might be a good idea to disconnect for a bit. Maybe it would be good for me, give me some perspective. The cabin was in a part of Idaho that felt isolated from the rest of the world. We weren't exactly close, Danny and I. We were family, yes, but we hadn't seen each other much in recent years. I was 29 and Danny was a few years younger. His invitation came out of the blue. I think he was just looking for someone to help him with a few things at the cabin, but I didn't mind. I could use the break. I remember the drive up, dirt roads winding through forests so dense I could barely see beyond the trees. The cabin itself was tucked away on a small clearing next to a creek. Danny had renovated it a bit, but it still had that old rustic charm. The kind of charm that looked pretty in a photo but had a way of feeling a little cold when you were actually there. When I arrived, Danny greeted me at the door, his face splitting into a grin. He was a tall guy, a little scruffy, with dark hair that he rarely bothered to cut. He looked like someone who spent too much time outdoors, but he seemed genuinely happy to see me. "You made it," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The inside of the cabin was cozy, though everything smelled faintly of old wood and must. There were wooden beams along the ceiling, a stone fireplace on one wall, and large windows that overlooked the creek and the trees beyond. It had an almost comforting feel to it, though I couldn't shake a small, creeping sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air. Danny showed me to the guest room, a simple bed with a quilt on it, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the woods. The place had everything I needed, and yet, there was something about the silence here that felt unnerving. I didn't hear birds or insects or anything, just the quiet rustling of trees in the wind. That night, after a quick dinner, we sat by the fire in the living room. It was strange. There was something oddly intense about being so far from civilization. I kept feeling like I was being watched, but whenever I looked around, all I saw were the shadows of the trees outside the window, the flames flickering and crackling in the fireplace, and Danny, casually sipping a beer. We didn't talk much. He seemed content to let the silence settle between us. I thought about going to bed early, but something about the atmosphere in the cabin kept me wide awake. The wind outside had picked up, the branches creaking and groaning against the weight of it. Around midnight, I decided I needed some fresh air. I slipped on my shoes and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me like a sudden shock. The sky was clear, and I could see stars spread out above me like tiny, twinkling diamonds. The creek babbled softly in the background, but it was the only sound. The quietness of the place was absolute. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. But then I felt it, something off, like I wasn't alone. I tried to shake it off, blaming the isolation for making me paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I glanced around, but there was nothing, just the forest, dark and still. That's when I heard it. A faint noise, almost like a twig snapping. A soft crunch in the woods, too far for it to be anything Danny would be doing. I turned quickly, my heart suddenly racing, but when I looked, nothing was there, just the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling, that creeping sensation that I was being watched. I hurried back into the cabin, trying to tell myself it was nothing, probably just a raccoon or some other animal. But the air inside didn't feel quite as warm now, and the silence seemed more suffocating. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I hardly slept. I lay there in bed, staring out the window, listening to the wind outside, waiting for morning to come. When I finally drifted off, I had vivid dreams. Nothing too strange, but unsettling enough to make me toss and turn all night. The next day, Danny suggested we go out to explore the woods a little. I didn't really want to, but I felt like I needed to shake off the unease I'd been feeling. So we grabbed our gear and headed out. We didn't go far, just a short walk through the trees, but the further we went, the more I felt like the woods were pressing in on us. I wasn't sure if it was the claustrophobia of the trees or the strange quiet that seemed to hang in the air, but something about it felt off. As we walked, Danny talked about the cabin, about the renovations he'd done, and about how he loved the solitude. He mentioned how he'd come out here alone a lot in the past, but lately he hadn't been able to stay for too long. I thought that was strange. He didn't seem like someone who would be scared of being alone in the woods. After a while, we sat down near the creek to rest. I noticed something odd, though. There was something in the water just below the surface. Something unnatural. It was too dark, too still. I couldn't make it out at first, but when I focused, I realized it was a shape like a bundle of sticks or debris, but it was too organized to be natural. I stood up, feeling a twinge of discomfort. "What's that?" I asked, pointing at the strange object. Danny turned, squinting. "Huh, that's weird," he said. "I didn't notice that before." He stood up and walked over to the edge of the creek, bending down to get a better look. I hesitated, unsure if I should follow. Something in my gut told me not to, but I did anyway. As I approached, I could see it more clearly. It was a bundle of branches, wrapped tightly in something that looked like old, frayed rope. It wasn't like anything I had seen before in nature. Danny reached out to poke it, and as he did, something shifted beneath the surface. He jumped back, startled, and I took a step back too, my pulse quickening. The water rippled and then settled again, but now there was an unmistakable shape underneath. I couldn't see exactly what it was, but the sight sent a chill down my spine. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice shaky. That's not right." Danny nodded, clearly uncomfortable as well, though he didn't admit it outright. We turned and began walking back to the cabin, but as we did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. It was just a hunch, but it felt real. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see something lurking just out of view. When we finally returned to the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. The cabin's walls felt like a barrier between me and whatever was out there, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't leave me. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. I kept hearing noises, scratching sounds on the walls, and faint tapping on the windows. But every time I checked, nothing was there. The next morning, Danny was packing up his things, preparing to leave. Couldn't blame him. I had planned on staying for another day, but I felt like I needed to go too. The place didn't feel safe anymore. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the cabin disappear into the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for us in those woods. Something that had been there long before we arrived, and would remain long after we were gone. But the strangest part? I couldn't tell Danny what I was feeling. He was too busy trying to act like everything was normal, like nothing had happened. But I knew we had disturbed something, and the woods would never forget. It was late September when I decided to head up to the cabin. I had been dealing with a lot at work, and the city's noise was starting to feel like too much. The idea of getting away to a small cabin tucked away in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. It was going to be just me, the quiet, and the trees. The cabin I had rented was located about 3 hours from the nearest town, deep in the forest of northern Maine. I had rented it for a week. The owner, an older woman named Mrs. Pritchard, told me the cabin had been in her family for decades, and it was peaceful and private, perfect for getting away from it all. I was in my late 20s and had always enjoyed the outdoors, so I wasn't too worried about being alone. The drive up took longer than I had anticipated, the winding, narrow roads getting steeper as I ventured farther into the woods. The trees grew thicker, and I found myself feeling increasingly isolated as the hours passed. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was setting quickly, and the wind had started to pick up, carrying a chill that seemed to bite right through my jacket. The cabin was exactly what I had expected. Small, rustic, and weathered, with a slanted roof and a porch that overlooked a clearing surrounded by dense forest. The gravel driveway was covered in leaves, and there was a pile of firewood stacked by the door. I pulled my car up and parked, staring at the place for a moment, letting the quiet sink in. There wasn't another house for miles, and the only sounds I could hear were the wind rustling through the trees and the distant call of birds. I grabbed my bags and made my way inside. The air smelled like wood and earth, a sharp contrast to the stale city air I was used to. The interior was simple, but it had everything I needed. A small kitchen, a couch, a fireplace, and a loft bedroom. There were old photographs on the walls, faded portraits of people I didn't recognize, and a few paintings of landscapes that seemed to match the view outside. I put my bags down, lit a fire in the stove, and made myself a cup of tea. As the evening wore on, the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees. It felt colder than it should have been, even for late September. I tried to ignore the growing unease that crept in with the night. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. I couldn't hear anything besides the wind, and it felt almost as though the whole world had gone to sleep. I sat by the fire, reading a book, but my mind kept drifting. Every creak and groan of the wooden floor made me jump, and the shadows outside seemed to move with the breeze. There was no real reason for it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling grew, until I finally decided to call it a night and head to bed. The loft was small, with a simple bed and a window that overlooked the forest. I pulled the covers up around me and tried to sleep, but the sound of the wind outside kept me awake. It wasn't just the wind, it was something else. Something unfamiliar. A low sound, almost like scratching, came from the direction of the porch. I tried to ignore it, but the sound didn't stop. It came in steady intervals, each one louder than the last. The rational part of me told me it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or something digging around outside, but the thought didn't comfort me. What bothered me more was that it seemed deliberate, almost as though someone was out there, tapping at the walls of the cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I told myself to stay calm, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the more I listened, the more the sound became impossible to ignore. It was coming from the porch, and it wasn't just scratching. It was knocking, soft but unmistakable. I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight from my bag. Slowly, I made my way down the stairs and to the door, trying to steady my breathing. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a moment, I considered just staying inside and locking the door. But curiosity won out, and I opened it, the cold air rushing in. The porch was empty. No one was there. I stood there for a moment, looking out into the darkness. The forest beyond the porch was eerily still. There were no sounds, no movement, just the wind whispering through the trees. My breath misted in the cold air, and I felt an odd mix of relief and unease. I locked the door behind me and went back upstairs, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The next day, I decided to take a hike. I needed to clear my mind and distract myself from the unsettling experience. The weather was crisp, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call. The path I chose led me deeper into the woods, winding along a stream before it began to climb higher into the hills. It wasn't until I reached the top of the hill that I realized just how far I had gone. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, a tiny speck in the distance. I sat down on a large rock to rest, enjoying the peace of the moment. I was miles away from any sign of civilization, and I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. That was when I noticed it. A set of footprints, large and deep, leading off the trail and into the woods. They were fresh, not more than a day old. I stood up, my heart racing, and followed them for a few minutes. The prints led to a small clearing, where I found an abandoned campfire, long since burned out. I stopped, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The prints were leading in the direction of the cabin. My first instinct was to turn around and go back, but something stopped me. A sense of urgency, a feeling I couldn't explain. I turned and hurried back down the hill, my mind racing. When I reached the cabin, I immediately checked the porch. There were no signs of anyone having been there recently, no footprints, no disturbance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rest of the day was uneventful. I spent the evening by the fire again, trying to relax, but the unease stayed with me. The next morning, I decided to leave. I wasn't sure what had happened the night before, but I had seen enough to know I wasn't alone in those woods. I packed up my things and left the cabin, the forest closing in behind me as I drove away. As I made my way back down the narrow road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me there. something that had been watching just out of sight. The road curved, and I took one last look at the cabin in the distance. The trees stood silent, the wind still, as though nothing had ever happened. I let out a breath, relieved to be leaving, but there was one question that lingered in my mind. Who had been in those woods with me, and why had they left without a trace? It was the middle of October when I decided to get away from everything. The stress of work, the constant noise of the city, it was getting to me. I was 32, a graphic designer by trade, and I had spent far too many years in front of a screen, living in a small apartment downtown. So, I packed my car with a few essentials and drove north, leaving behind the city's lights and sounds. I found a small, rustic cabin for rent online. It wasn't far from the nearest town, but it was still secluded enough to make me feel like I could breathe again. I didn't want anything fancy, just a cozy little spot where I could clear my head, maybe do some reading, and enjoy the silence for a few days. When I pulled up to the cabin, I was relieved. It looked just like the pictures. Set against the backdrop of a dense forest, the cabin was simple but charming, with a stone chimney, a small porch, and weathered wooden beams. The driveway was gravel, and the only sound I could hear was the crunch of tires against it as I parked. There was no one around, just the endless stretch of trees and the faint smell of pine in the air. I unloaded my car, grabbed my bag, and went inside. The cabin had that musty, earthy smell you get in places that aren't often used. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I walked through the small living room and into the kitchen. There was a wood stove in the corner, an old fridge, and a basic stove. Everything was a little dated, but that was part of the charm. It was the perfect place to disconnect. After I unpacked, I spent the rest of the afternoon reading by the fire. The sun dipped behind the trees, and I could hear the wind picking up outside, rustling the branches. It was peaceful, but the kind of peaceful that makes you hyper-aware of the world around you. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving outside. It was probably just the wind or an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to get some rest early. The bed was simple, with a thick quilt that smelled of wood and old linens. As I lay there, listening to the wind howl outside, I felt an odd sense of isolation. There was something both comforting and unsettling about being so far away from everyone. The silence was heavy, and the longer I lay there, the more it felt like I was being watched. I chalked it up to the stillness of the place. It was the kind of silence that could play tricks on your mind. The first night passed without incident, but the next morning, I woke up to find the weather had changed. A thick fog had rolled in, and the air was damp. The visibility was low, and I could barely see the trees that were just a few feet away from the cabin. I thought about heading into town, but something told me to stay put. Maybe I was just enjoying the solitude too much. I spent the day inside, reading, cooking a simple meal, and listening to the wind whip against the cabin. I noticed more sounds that day, scratching noises against the walls, a faint thumping from the attic. But I dismissed it all as nothing more than the house settling. It wasn't until late afternoon, when I decided to take a walk, that things started to feel strange. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The fog had thickened, and the woods seemed to swallow the cabin whole. I could barely see the trail that led through the trees, but I decided to follow it anyway. The air was cold, and the ground was soft under my boots, damp with the mist. The longer I walked, the more the silence pressed in on me. The forest felt almost too still, as though it were holding its breath. I had no real destination, just wanted to stretch my legs. But after what felt like an hour of walking, I realized I hadn't seen any other footprints. It was like I was the only person who had ever walked this trail, like the place had been abandoned for years. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off and kept walking. Eventually, I reached a small clearing, and that's when I noticed it. A pile of old, broken branches stacked in the center. At first, I thought it was just debris, but the way they were arranged felt too deliberate. I knelt down to get a better look, and that's when I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. At the base of the pile was a small, hand-carved figure. Just a simple wooden doll, its features weathered by time, but unmistakable. I didn't touch it. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. The air felt heavier now, as if the fog had seeped into my very bones. A thought crossed my mind. Someone had been here recently, but who? And why had they left this strange thing behind? I turned and made my way back to the cabin, my pace quickening as the fog thickened even more. By the time I got back to the porch, the fog was so dense I could barely see the steps in front of me. I fumbled for the door, pushed it open, and rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. The warmth of the cabin hit me, but it did little to ease the unease that had settled in my chest. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But something had changed. The house felt different now, like it was holding something in. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I needed to leave. Something wasn't right. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the windows. Every little creak and groan of the house made my heart race. I finally decided to check the attic, thinking maybe there was an animal in the walls or something. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the narrow staircase to the attic. The door creaked open with a sound that sent chills down my spine. The attic was dusty and cramped, filled with old furniture and boxes. I shone the flashlight around, half expecting to find nothing but cobwebs. But then I saw it. Another wooden figure, sitting on top of an old trunk. This one was larger, more detailed. It looked like a person, though the features were rough and unfinished. It had no eyes, just empty holes where they should have been. My stomach lurched. Who had been leaving these things around? I had enough. The fear that had been building up inside me all day exploded into a full-blown panic. I grabbed my things, rushed downstairs, and stuffed everything back into my bag. I wasn't staying another night in that cabin. I didn't care if it was just a coincidence or if I was imagining things. I wasn't going to take any chances. I locked the door behind me, got in my car, and drove straight back to the nearest town. The fog was thick, but I didn't care. I didn't even look back at the cabin as I drove away. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it all or if there was something truly off about that place, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. It wasn't until I got back to the city that I heard the news. A couple of days later, there was a report about a missing hiker who had been found dead in the woods near that cabin. The details were sparse, but one thing stood out. His body had been found with a strange wooden figure near his feet. Something about the way it was described sent a chill through me. I couldn't help but think back to that clearing in the woods and the figures I had found. Had I narrowly escaped something? I didn't know, but I wasn't going back to find out. Whatever had been in those woods, whatever had left those figures behind, wasn't something I wanted to understand. I was just glad to be home, and I knew one thing for certain. Some places were meant to be left alone. I never imagined that a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the woods would turn into a nightmare. It was supposed to be a break from everything, a way to disconnect from the noise of everyday life. My name's Jack, and at 29, I thought I'd seen it all. I'd spent plenty of time hiking, camping, and exploring, but never alone in a place like this. The cabin was secluded, about 2 hours from the nearest town, deep in the hills of northern Pennsylvania. I had rented it from a small local company that specialized in off-the-grid properties, promising peace, quiet, and no distractions. I arrived on a Friday evening, the sun sinking behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the narrow dirt road leading up to the cabin. The place was more rustic than I had expected, but that's what I liked about it. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, nothing but the sounds of nature. The cabin itself was small, a single-story structure made of weathered logs, with a steeply pitched roof and a wide porch that wrapped around one side. A stone chimney puffed out thin streams of smoke from the fireplace inside, promising warmth for the night ahead. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence was almost deafening. I unloaded my things and settled in, starting a fire in the wood stove to chase away the chill. There was a small kitchen area, a living room with mismatched furniture, and a single bedroom in the back with a big, fluffy bed. The place was cozy in a way that felt almost like home, but more isolated. It was perfect, exactly what I needed. The first night passed without incident. I spent the evening reading a book, listening to the crackle of the fire, and enjoying the stillness. But as I lay in bed later, trying to fall asleep, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on exactly, but there was a sense of unease in the air. I dismissed it as nothing more than the result of being in a new place, alone for the first time in a while. Around 2 a.m., I was woken by a loud, unmistakable sound. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the old beams creaking under the weight of the night. But then I heard it again, a dull thud, like something heavy had been dropped. My heart rate picked up, but I tried to shake off the anxiety creeping into my chest. I got out of bed and walked to the window, peering out into the dark. Nothing, just the endless stretch of trees, the wind rustling through the leaves. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the blackness, and that's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost like footsteps, moving through the woods. My breath caught in my throat. It was too faint to make out clearly, but the rhythm was steady, deliberate. I knew it wasn't an animal. It sounded too intentional. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that there were probably people hiking in the area, maybe even hunters. It was the middle of the night, though. Still, I forced myself to turn away from the window and go back to bed, hoping I'd drift off again. The rest of the night passed without further disturbance, but the unease didn't fully leave me. The next morning, I took a walk around the property, trying to clear my head. The cabin was surrounded by thick woods on all sides, and there was a small trail that led down to a creek nearby. As I followed the trail, I noticed something strange. Footprints, fresh ones, about the size of a boot print, leading toward the creek and then disappearing into the underbrush. I crouched down to inspect them, my mind racing. They were clear, but there was no sign of anyone around. The tracks looked recent, but there was no other indication of who or what might have made them. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I tried to brush it off. People probably hike through here all the time. Still, the thought of being out here alone with someone or something else nearby made me feel more exposed than I liked. That day, I tried to stay busy. I chopped wood, gathered more kindling for the fire, and even took a nap in the afternoon, hoping to shake the feeling that something was watching me. But it never went away. The footsteps from the night before kept echoing in my mind, and I couldn't stop wondering who else could possibly be out here. As evening fell, the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees. It sounded different now, more intense, like it was forcing its way through the forest. I tried to ignore it, focusing on cooking myself a simple dinner, but as the night wore on, I couldn't help but feel like I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. I went to bed early again, trying to keep my mind calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sound of the wind grew louder, and at one point, I heard something hit the side of the cabin, like a rock or a branch. My pulse quickened, and I sat up, listening intently. Another thud, this time from the porch. It was unmistakable, and I felt my heart race as I slowly got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. I cautiously made my way to the living room, holding the beam of the flashlight out in front of me, casting a narrow circle of light across the room. There was nothing there, no sign of anyone, just the eerie silence that filled the space. I checked the windows, the doors, and the porch, but everything seemed normal. My nerves were getting the better of me, so I locked the door, closed the curtains, and went back to bed, trying to force myself to sleep. But I couldn't. The rest of the night was filled with strange noises, scratching sounds against the walls, the creaking of the floorboards, and the unmistakable feeling that someone else was in the cabin. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I felt the presence of something there, just outside the edge of my perception, like a shadow lurking in the corner of my vision. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things, made sure the cabin was secure, and left. As I drove back down the winding road, I looked back once, just to see the cabin fading into the trees. But something told me it wouldn't be the last time I saw it.